The fog on Highway 101 doesn't just roll in, it takes people with it. Last winter, 18 drivers saw the same figure moving through the mist, all describing identical details they couldn't possibly know. Some made it out to tell what happened in those missing hours. Others are still driving, trapped somewhere between mile markers that don't exist anymore. Tonight, you're about to hear what they saw in the white. The stretch of Highway 1001 between Cannon Beach and Manzanita has always been unforgiving. Narrow curves hugging cliff faces, dense coastal fog rolling in without warning, and that perpetual smell of salt and rotting kelp that clings to everything. For truckers making the Portland to California run, it's a necessary evil. A 50-mile gauntlet where you white-knuckle the wheel and pray your brakes hold on the descents. But over the last 2 years, something's changed on that road, specifically around mile marker 28. And the trucking community has started sharing stories in hushed voices at rest stops and truck washes. Stories that sound impossible until you talk to the men and women who lived through them. Sean was the first to report it in January 2023, though at the time, nobody believed him. He'd been hauling refrigerated seafood down from Astoria, running his usual overnight route to beat the morning traffic, when the fog came in so thick around 2 a.m. that visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet. Sean told the dispatcher later that the fog that night wasn't normal. It didn't drift or swirl the way coastal fog usually does, but instead pressed against his windshield like something solid, something that wanted in. He'd slowed to 30 miles per hour, hazards flashing, when he felt the temperature inside his cab drop so suddenly that his breath came out in visible clouds despite the heater running full blast. That's when he smelled it. Not the clean ocean air or even the fish he was hauling, but something rotten, something that made his stomach heave and his eyes water, like meat left in the sun for days. Sean glanced at his passenger seat, and that's when he saw him. The figure was sitting there, perfectly still, wrapped head to toe in bandages that were soaked through with something dark that looked black in the dim light of the cab. Sean swears he screamed, jerking the wheel hard enough that his trailer fish-tailed on the wet pavement, nearly sending him over the guardrail and down the 100-foot drop to the rocks below. When he looked again, the passenger seat was empty, but the smell remained, and when he reached over with a shaking hand to touch the seat, his fingers came away sticky. He drove straight through to the next truck stop 40 miles south. Didn't stop, didn't slow down, just kept his foot on the gas and his eyes locked straight ahead. At the truck stop, under the fluorescent lights, Sean examined his passenger seat and found it stained with something rust-colored that his cleaning supplies couldn't remove. And more disturbing, there were thin strips of what looked like gauze embedded in the upholstery. Gauze that carried that same stomach-turning smell of decay. The company wrote it off as exhaustion, maybe contamination from his cargo. But Sean refused to run that route at night ever again. 6 months later, in July 2023, a driver named Gustavo had an encounter that was eerily similar, but somehow worse. Gustavo had been driving trucks for 23 years, a veteran who didn't spook easily and had seen his share of strange things on the road. He was hauling lumber south on Highway 101, making good time despite patches of fog. When around mile marker 28, his truck's electronics started acting up. His radio cycling through stations on its own, his GPS screen flickering between the map and complete static, his dashboard lights dimming and brightening without pattern. Gustavo thought it was an electrical problem, nothing more, until he felt the cab lurch slightly to the right, the way it does when someone climbs into the passenger side. He turned his head and saw a figure sitting beside him, wrapped in dirty bandages that were stained with dried blood. And even in the darkness of the cab, he could see that the bandages were moving slightly, as if whatever was underneath them was still breathing, still shifting. The figure's head was turned toward him, and though Gustavo couldn't see eyes or a face through the wrappings, he felt absolutely certain that it was watching him, studying him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Gustavo did something that surprised even himself. He spoke to it. He asked, voice shaking, "What do you want?" And the figure didn't respond with words. But Gustavo heard something, a wet, rattling sound, like breathing through fluid-filled lungs, and the smell hit him so hard he gagged, nearly vomiting right there in his cab. The bandaged figure raised one wrapped hand slowly, pointing forward through the windshield, and Gustavo followed the gesture to see the fog ahead suddenly illuminated by his headlights, revealing a sharp curve in the road he'd somehow forgotten was there. He slammed on his brakes, downshifting hard, and managed to make the turn, though his trailer slid sickeningly close to the cliff edge. So close he could hear gravel tumbling down into the darkness below. When his heart stopped pounding enough for him to look at his passenger seat again, it was empty. But his truck reeked of rotting flesh so badly he had to pull over and open both doors, letting the ocean wind blast through for 10 minutes before he could continue. Like Sean, Gustavo found stains on his passenger seat, rusty brown marks that looked like handprints. And when he touched them, they felt cold, far colder than they should have been. Cold like touching ice that had been sitting in a freezer for months. He also found something Sean hadn't mentioned. Several long strips of old-fashioned gauze bandaging tangled in his seat adjustment lever, stiff with dried blood and giving off that terrible smell that seemed to stick to everything it touched. The third incident, in September 2024, gave everyone the proof they'd been unconsciously hoping wouldn't exist. Mariah was a rare woman in long-haul trucking, running routes up and down the West Coast for 15 years. And she'd installed a high-quality dash cam system in her rig after a false insurance claim nearly cost her everything. She was hauling electronics from Seattle to Sacramento, taking Highway 101 through Oregon because it was peaceful at night, and she liked watching the ocean when the moon was out. Around 11 p.m., near mile marker 28, though she didn't know the significance of that location yet, Mariah drove straight into a fog bank so dense it felt like driving through milk, so thick she could barely see the hood of her own truck. Her dashcam, which recorded both the road ahead and the interior of her cab, captured everything that happened next. And that footage is what finally made believers out of the skeptics. The interior footage, which Mariah only watched after getting home 3 days later, shows her driving normally for several minutes, occasionally rubbing her arms as if cold. Though the timestamp on her climate control display shows her heater was on full blast. Then, at timestamp 23:17:43, something appears in her passenger seat, not gradually, not climbing in, but simply materializing as if it had always been there, and reality was just now catching up. The figure is wrapped entirely in bandages, and the camera's night vision mode makes the dark stains on them appear almost luminescent, glowing with a sick greenish tint that makes your stomach turn just looking at it. For nearly 8 seconds, the figure sits motionless, and Mariah, visible in the frame, appears completely unaware of its presence. Her eyes focused on the road ahead as she navigates through the impossible fog. Then Mariah's head turns slowly toward the passenger seat, and her expression in that moment, the way her face drains of color, the way her mouth opens in a silent scream, the way her hands grip the steering wheel so hard her knuckles go white, is genuinely disturbing to watch. The footage shows Mariah's truck swerving slightly as she recoils from whatever she's seeing, and the figure remains perfectly still for another 3 seconds before it begins to turn its head toward her. The movement is wrong somehow. too smooth and too slow, like something mechanical rather than human. And when the bandaged head is fully facing her direction, the camera picks up something that makes your blood run cold. The bandages around where the mouth should be are moving, pulsing outward as if something underneath is trying to push through. Mariah is screaming now. You can see it in her face, even though the audio is overwhelmed by static. And she reaches toward her passenger seat, as if to push the figure away. Her hand passes through empty air. The figure has vanished. But her momentum carries her forward, and her palm lands on the passenger seat. And you can see on the footage the exact moment she realizes the seat is wet with something dark. Mariah pulls her hand back and stares at it. And even in the poor lighting of the night vision camera, you can see the sticky substance coating her fingers, can see the way she frantically wipes it on her jeans, can see the moment she rolls down both windows and starts breathing in gulps of the fog-thick air. The rest of the footage shows Mariah pulling over onto the shoulder, her hazard lights flashing, and for nearly 12 minutes she sits there with both hands on the wheel, breathing heavily, occasionally looking at her passenger seat with an expression of pure terror. When she finally starts driving again, she keeps her eyes locked forward, never once glancing to her right. And the timestamp shows she drove for another 43 minutes straight, without stopping until she reached the safety of a well-lit rest area. The next morning, in daylight, Mariah examined her truck and found exactly what Sean and Gustavo had found. Rust-colored stains on the passenger seat that wouldn't come out no matter how much she scrubbed, strips of old gauze caught in the seat mechanisms. And that smell, that horrible smell of decay, that seemed to have soaked into the fabric itself. But Mariah had something the others didn't have. Video proof that couldn't be explained away as exhaustion or imagination. She showed the footage to other drivers first, then to her company's safety manager, then eventually to local law enforcement. Nobody could explain what the camera had recorded. Nobody could explain how a figure could appear and disappear in a moving, locked truck. And nobody could explain the physical evidence left behind. The footage was analyzed by video experts who confirmed it hadn't been edited or manipulated. The timestamps matched up with her GPS records, and the stains on her seat tested positive for human blood. Old blood, blood that had been dried for decades. The local sheriff's department, when pressed for answers, finally revealed that mile marker 28 on Highway 101 has been the site of numerous accidents over the years. And one in particular from the 1950s involved a man who'd been in a terrible logging accident, wrapped in bandages, trying to flag down help on the highway before he collapsed and died, right there on the shoulder. Since then, there have been scattered reports of a bandaged figure appearing in that area, always during thick fog, always in the passenger seats of trucks, and always leaving behind the same evidence. Bloodstains, gauze fragments, and that unbearable smell of death. Mariah still drives trucks, but like Sean and Gustavo, she won't take Highway 101 through that stretch at night anymore, especially when the fog rolls in from the Pacific. The three of them have compared notes, have confirmed that their experiences match down to the smallest details, and they've joined a growing list of drivers who've encountered something on that foggy stretch of road that defies explanation. The trucking community has started warning newer drivers about mile marker 28, about keeping your doors locked and your eyes forward when the fog gets thick, about not stopping for anyone or anything between Cannon Beach and Manzanita after dark. Because whatever's out there in the fog, wrapped in those blood-soaked bandages, is still looking for a ride. Still climbing into passenger seats, still leaving behind proof that some things don't stay buried even after decades have passed. And if you ever find yourself driving Highway 101 on a foggy night and you smell something rotten, something like decay, well, check your passenger seat quickly. Because you might not be driving alone anymore. The case file sits on Detective Vicente Ramirez's desk even now, 2 years after it happened, and he still opens it sometimes late at night when he can't sleep. Still reads through the witness statements and looks at the photographs. Still tries to make sense of what happened on Highway 20 in November 2022. It was supposed to be a simple missing persons case. Family breaks down in bad weather, wanders off looking for help. Search and rescue brings them home. But nothing about the Wilson family disappearance was simple, and the more Vicente investigated, the less sense any of it made. Liliana Wilson, her husband Danny, and their 2 children Madeline and Drake left Seattle on November 18, 2022, heading east on Highway 20 for a long weekend at a cabin near Winthrop. The weather forecast called for clear skies, maybe some light fog in the mountain passes, nothing unusual for November in the North Cascades. Liliana had texted her sister Helena at 4:47 p.m., just past Marble Mount, saying they were making good time and would arrive before dark. That was the last normal communication anyone received from the family. What happened next was reconstructed from their vehicle's dashcam footage, recovered text messages, and the testimony of other motorists trapped in what meteorologists would later classify as a super fog event. Wildfire smoke from a smoldering forest fire near Cascade Pass mixing with dense mountain fog to create visibility conditions that were, in some places, literally zero. The National Weather Service hadn't predicted it, couldn't have predicted it, because the fire that caused it was so small. Just a lightning strike holdover from September that had been burning underground in the duff layer. Invisible but pumping out smoke that mixed with the evening fog to create something that witnesses described as breathing through wet cotton and driving inside a cloud made of poison. The Wilson family's dashcam, which recorded continuously to a cloud storage service until the cell signal died, shows them driving into the superfog at approximately 5:23 p.m. One moment of the road ahead is visible. Trees lining both sides, the last rays of sunset filtering through the mountain passes. And then, nothing. The fog doesn't roll in gradually. It appears like a wall, and when their SUV enters it, the entire world outside their windows turns orange-brown, thick, impenetrable. The audio picks up Danny's voice saying, "Jesus, what is this?" And Liliana responding, "Smoke. That's smoke mixed with fog. We need to pull over." The last few seconds of video show their brake lights illuminating the fog behind them, turning it a hellish red, and then their vehicle comes to a complete stop. The dashcam lost connection at 5:27 p.m. But the audio continued recording for another 18 minutes, automatically uploaded in chunks whenever the phone caught brief bursts of signal. What that audio captured has been analyzed by multiple agencies, played and replayed hundreds of times, and it raises more questions than it answers. For the first few minutes, the family sounds calm. Danny tries the radio. Liliana attempts to call 911 but can't get through. Madeline asks if they're going to be okay. And Drake, only 6 years old, says he doesn't like the smell. The smell, multiple witnesses would later report, was distinctive. Not just smoke, but something chemical. Something that made your eyes water and your throat close, something that got inside your head and made it hard to think straight. At minute 7, things begin to change. Liliana's voice, previously calm, becomes strained. "Danny, do you hear that?" Danny responds, "Hear what?" And she says, "Outside it sounds like footsteps, like someone walking around the car." The audio picks up something then, difficult to distinguish from the ambient noise of wind and settling fog. But when the sound file is amplified and filtered, you can hear it, a rhythmic sound like boots on pavement circling their vehicle. Danny's voice. "Stay in the car. Doors are locked. We're staying put until this clears." And Madeline, voice small and frightened. "Dad, there's someone outside my window." At minute 11, Liliana's phone managed to send one text message to her sister Helena. It took 43 minutes for the message to actually transmit, by which time everything was already over. But the timestamp shows it was composed at 5:38 p.m. The message reads, "Stuck in fog, Jatsu 20 past Marble Mount, can't see anything, something walking around car. Danny says, stay inside, can't breathe, air is wrong." Helena, receiving this message after 6 p.m., immediately called 911. But by then the superfog had closed Highway 20 in both directions, and emergency services couldn't reach the area. The audio recording becomes increasingly disturbing after minute 14. Drake starts crying, saying, "They're looking at us. They're looking at us." And Madeline's voice rises in panic. "Dad, I can see shapes in the fog. They're tall. They're too tall." Danny tries to calm them, tells them it's just the fog playing tricks, but his voice betrays his own fear. Liliana can be heard breathing rapidly, possibly hyperventilating, and she whispers something that sounds like, "They're not moving like people, Danny. They don't move right." At minute 17, the final and most troubling sequence begins. Liliana's voice, suddenly clear and strangely calm. "Danny, look, there are lights. There are lights out there, moving through the fog." Danny, "What kind of lights?" Liliana, "Like flashlights. Maybe it's search and rescue. Maybe someone's coming to help us." There's a pause, and then Danny's voice, uncertain. "Those lights they're not on the ground, Lil. They're floating. They're moving up and down like..." And his voice trails off. Madeline, "Can we follow them? Maybe they're trying to show us the way back to the road." And then Liliana, with heartbreaking hope in her voice, "We're getting out to follow the lights back to the road." The audio ends at 5:45 p.m. with the sounds of car doors opening, and then nothing. No screams, no struggle, no indication of violence, just the sound of wind and fog. And after about 30 seconds, the distinctive beep of a vehicle alarm system engaging because all doors were open simultaneously. The recording device continued running for another 3 minutes, capturing only environmental sounds. Wind, the vehicle's hazard lights clicking, and in the background, barely audible even with enhancement, what might be multiple sets of footsteps moving away from the vehicle. Highway 20 reopened the next morning when the superfog finally dissipated, and a state trooper named Chris found the Wilson family's SUV at 7:15 a.m. The vehicle was sitting on the highway with all 4 doors wide open, engines still running, hazard lights flashing. The keys were in the ignition. Liliana's phone was on the passenger seat. The children's tablets were still playing videos in the back seat. Nothing was missing from the vehicle. Luggage, wallets, winter coats still folded in the back, emergency supplies untouched. It was as if the family had simply stepped out for a moment and would be right back. Detective Vicente arrived on scene by 9 a.m. and immediately knew something was profoundly wrong. The Wilson vehicle was found on Highway 20 itself, not on a shoulder or pulled off onto a side road, but sitting in the middle of the eastbound lane. There was no reason for the family to have exited the vehicle. They were on the road, not lost, not off course. And Liliana's final text message said Danny had told them to stay inside. More disturbing were the details Vicente noticed when examining the vehicle closely. The driver's side door handle had a residue on it, a sooty substance mixed with something that looked like condensed moisture. And when tested, it came back as a combination of wildfire particulates and an unidentified organic compound. All 4 door handles had this same residue, as if something had touched them, had examined them, before the family opened the doors from inside. The search began immediately, with over 100 volunteers combing the area. Search dogs were brought in, and they behaved strangely, refusing to track from the vehicle, whining and pulling back toward the road, acting as if there was no scent trail to follow. Helicopter crews with thermal imaging found nothing. The search expanded to a 5-mile radius, then 10 miles, covering hundreds of acres of dense forest. On the third day, a search team found Drake's shoe. It was 0.3 miles into the forest, off a hiking trail, sitting on a fallen log facing away from the highway. The shoe was clean, no mud, no signs of having been worn through the forest, and it was placed carefully, deliberately, as if someone had set it there. That was the only trace of the Wilson family ever found. Vicente interviewed other motorists who had been trapped in the same super fog event. Their testimonies were consistent and troubling. A trucker named Gustavo reported seeing shapes moving through the fog, tall shapes that didn't walk right, that seemed to glide rather than step. A couple from Portland, Aubrey and Milo, said they saw lights in the fog, floating lights that moved with apparent intelligence, and they both felt an overwhelming compulsion to follow them. They stayed in their car only because Milo had grabbed Aubrey's arm and held her back when she tried to open the door. A local woman named Salem reported that her GPS had gone haywire during the super fog, showing her position as moving along roads that don't exist, moving through areas that were marked as dense forest. The case remains open, filed under unexplained disappearances. Vicente has his theories, none of which he can prove, and most of which he doesn't share publicly. The official report states that the Wilson family left their vehicle during a severe super fog event, possibly experiencing disorientation and hypoxia from smoke inhalation, and became lost in the surrounding wilderness. The report notes that the extreme conditions and rugged terrain make recovery of remains unlikely. What the report doesn't mention is that Vicente has found 17 other incident reports from Highway 20 over the past 30 years, all involving vehicles found abandoned during fog events, all with occupants who were never located. It doesn't mention that in 6 of these cases, witnesses reported seeing lights in the fog, or that in 9 cases, search dogs refused to track from the vehicles. It doesn't mention the audio recording that keeps Vicente awake at night, or the way Liliana Wilson's voice sounded so hopeful when she said they were following the lights back to the road. The most disturbing detail, the one Vicente can't get out of his head, came from analyzing the cloud-stored dashcam data. The video stopped at 5:27 p.m., but the camera's metadata shows it continued recording for another 32 minutes. The video files for those 32 minutes are corrupted, show nothing but static and geometric patterns, but the file sizes indicate the camera was recording something. Something was happening in front of that camera, something that somehow corrupted the video while leaving the audio intact. And whatever that something was, it convinced an entire family to step out of their locked vehicle in zero visibility conditions and walk into the fog, leaving everything behind. Vicente sometimes wonders if the Wilson family is still out there somewhere, still following those lights, still believing they're finding their way back to a road they never left. Because the one thing he's certain of, the one thing all the evidence points to, is that they didn't just get lost. They were taken, and whatever took them knew exactly how to make them open those doors. The first time Phoenix Rodriguez picked her up was February 2021, and he still remembers every detail of that night with a clarity that feels wrong. Like the memory has been burned into his brain with chemicals he can't wash out. Phoenix had been driving between Salem and Sisters, making the late-night run because the pay was better and the traffic was non-existent, and he knew Highway 22 through Santiam Pass like he knew his own heartbeat. He'd driven it hundreds of times, knew every curve and switchback, could navigate it in his sleep. But that night, the freezing fog came in just past Mahama. The kind of fog that forms when the temperature drops below zero and the moisture in the air crystallizes, creating a white suspended mist that hovers at ground level and turns your headlights into useless beams of scattered light. Phoenix had slowed to maybe 25 miles per hour, both hands gripping the wheel, when he saw her standing on the shoulder near mile marker 76, just before the Hoodoo ski area turnoff. She was soaked through, her dark hair plastered to her face, wearing jeans and a light jacket completely inadequate for the sub-zero temperatures. And she had her thumb out in the universal gesture for needing a ride. Phoenix's first thought was that she was going to die out there if someone didn't help her. Because at that elevation in those conditions, hypothermia could kill you in under an hour. He pulled over, unlocked the passenger door, and she climbed in without a word, bringing with her a smell of rain and something else. Something like ozone, like the air before a lightning strike. "Thank you," she said, her voice flat and emotionless, like she was reading from a script. "I need to get to Salem." Phoenix told her he was heading that direction, asked if she was okay, asked what she was doing out there alone in this weather. She didn't answer his questions, just sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead through the windshield. And Phoenix noticed that despite being soaked through, she wasn't shivering, wasn't rubbing her arms for warmth, wasn't doing any of the things a freezing person should do. The temperature in his truck had dropped noticeably since she got in, cold enough that Phoenix could see his breath even with the heater running full blast. They drove in silence for about 15 minutes. Phoenix trying to focus on the road while sneaking glances at his passenger, trying to figure out what was wrong with this situation beyond the obvious. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with features that would have been pretty if they weren't so unnaturally still, like a photograph of a person rather than an actual living human being. "There's an accident up ahead," she said suddenly, breaking the silence, still not turning her head to look at him. "At the next curve, a rollover. You need to slow down now." Phoenix felt his stomach drop because he knew the curve she was talking about. It was a notorious spot, sharp and banked wrong, where black ice formed even when the rest of the road was clear. He slowed down, dropping his speed to 15 miles per hour. And as his headlights swept around the curve, he saw it. A pickup truck on its side, still sliding across the ice, sparks flying from metal scraping pavement. Phoenix slammed on his brakes, feeling his own truck start to slide on the black ice underneath the fog, managing to stop maybe 30 feet from the overturned vehicle. His heart was hammering, adrenaline flooding his system, and he turned to his passenger to ask how she could have possibly known. But the passenger seat was empty. She was gone. The door was still locked from the inside. The seat where she'd been sitting was dry. No moisture from her wet clothes. No indication she'd ever been there except for the lingering cold and that ozone smell. Phoenix called 911, helped the driver of the overturned truck, a man named Hassan who'd hit the ice and lost control. And when the state police arrived, he mentioned the hitchhiker to the officer, a woman named Michelle. Michelle's expression changed when Phoenix described the girl, becoming careful, guarded. She asked him to describe her again, asked what she was wearing. And when Phoenix finished, Michelle pulled out her phone and showed him a photograph. "Is this her?" she asked. And Phoenix felt ice water run down his spine because, yes, that was exactly her, same face, same hair, same light jacket. "That's Willa Turner," Michelle told him. "She died in a rollover accident at this exact spot in February 1994. We get reports of her a few times a year, always the same. She appears to drivers during freezing fog, warns them about accidents, and disappears from locked vehicles. The second incident happened in December 2022, and this time the driver was Alessandra Kim, a nurse driving home to Salem after a double shift at the hospital in Bend. Alessandra had worked 14 hours straight and was exhausted, running on coffee and determination, and she later told police that she probably shouldn't have been driving, but she wanted to sleep in her own bed. The freezing fog hit around 10 p.m., turning Santiam Pass into a nightmare of zero visibility and plummeting temperatures. Alessandra was navigating carefully, considering pulling over to wait it out, when she saw the woman standing on the shoulder near mile marker 76, thumb out, looking desperately cold. Alessandra pulled over immediately, her nursing instincts overriding any caution, and the woman climbed into her car. "I need to get home," the woman said in that same flat, emotionless voice Phoenix had heard. And Alessandra asked her name, asked if she needed medical attention. The woman didn't answer, just gave an address in Salem that Alessandra wrote down on a receipt, planning to drop her off there. The temperature in the car was dropping rapidly, and Alessandra felt herself getting drowsy, her exhaustion compounded by the heater, working overtime, and the hypnotic effect of driving through endless white fog. "You need to stay awake," the woman said, her voice cutting through Alessandra's fog-addled brain. "You're falling asleep. Pull over and rest." Alessandra tried to protest, said she was fine, but the woman's voice became insistent, almost commanding. "Pull over now, or you'll die in the next mile." The certainty in her voice was terrifying, and Alessandra, despite her exhaustion, managed to pull onto the shoulder and put her car in park. "Thank you for trying," the woman said softly, and when Alessandra turned to ask what she meant, the passenger seat was empty. The woman had vanished, and Alessandra sat there in shock, the cold slowly leaving her vehicle, until she heard the crash. A quarter-mile ahead, barely visible through the fog, orange flames were erupting from what looked like a semi-truck that had jackknifed and gone over the embankment. If Alessandra had kept driving, she would have reached that spot at exactly the moment the truck lost control. She called 911, gave her statement to the same officer Michelle who'd responded to Phoenix's incident 20 months earlier. And when she described her vanishing passenger, Michelle showed her the same photograph. Alessandra confirmed it was the same woman, and when she looked up the address the woman had given her, the address didn't exist. The street name was real, but the number would place it in the middle of the Willamette River. The third and most recent encounter was January 2023, and the driver was Rocky Chen, a college student heading back to Willamette University after winter break. Rocky had loaded his car with everything he needed for the semester and was making the drive at night to beat the morning traffic. He'd heard stories about Highway 22, about the accidents and the weird reports. But like most 20-year-olds, he thought he was invincible. The freezing fog materialized around mile marker 72, so suddenly that Rocky drove into it before he could slow down. And within seconds, he was completely disoriented, unable to see anything but white in every direction. Rocky was considering stopping, was reaching for his phone to call his parents, when he saw her, the woman standing on the shoulder exactly where Phoenix and Alessandra had seen her, wearing the same light jacket, same jeans, hair wet and face expressionless. Rocky pulled over, more out of curiosity than altruism if he's being honest, because he wanted to know what kind of person would be out here in these conditions. She got in without waiting for an invitation, bringing that same temperature drop, that same ozone smell. "Take me to 847 Madison Street in Salem," she said. And Rocky, pulling back onto the highway, told her he'd do his best, but the fog was making it nearly impossible to drive. "There's an accident ahead," she said, her voice carrying that same flat quality the others had described. At the curve. The same place it always happens. The ice forms there first, before anywhere else on the road. Rocky asked her how she knew, asked if she'd heard it on the radio, but she continued as if he hadn't spoken. I couldn't stop. I hit the ice and the car rolled 3 times. I was trapped for 6 hours before someone found me, but by then it was too late. The cold got me before the rescuers could. Rocky felt his blood turn to ice water as he realized what she was telling him. "When did this happen to you?" he asked, voice shaking. And she turned her head for the first time, looked directly at him with eyes that reflected his headlights like an animal's eyes, like there was nothing human behind them. "February 7th, 1994, she said. "My name is Willa Turner. I was 23 years old. I was driving home to Salem from Bend. I hit the ice at mile marker 76, and I died in the hospital 3 days later from hypothermia and internal injuries." Rocky's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the wheel. "Why are you telling me this?" he whispered. And Willa's expression didn't change, but her voice softened slightly. "Because you're about to reach the same curve. Because the fog does something to this place, makes the ice form in patterns that shouldn't exist, creates conditions that kill people every winter. Because I've been trying for 29 years to warn people, to stop what happened to me from happening to anyone else." Rocky slowed to barely moving, and his headlights caught the reflective paint of warning signs, indicating the sharp curve ahead. The same curve where 3 accidents had already been reported that winter. "Thank you for listening," Willa said, and Rocky looked over to see her fading, becoming transparent, like smoke dissipating in wind. "Thank you for trying to help me. Most people can't see me anymore. The fog is the only thing that makes me visible, the fog and the cold, conditions like the night I died." And then she was gone, leaving behind only the cold and that lingering ozone smell. Rocky made it through the curve safely, pulled over at the next rest area, and called the Oregon State Police. Officer Michelle, who by this point had taken over a dozen similar reports, met him there and showed him the photograph he was expecting to see. What makes these 3 incidents particularly notable is that all 3 drivers later went to the Marion County Clerk's office and requested accident reports from February 1994. They found Willa Turner's name, confirmed the date of her accident, February 7th, 1994. Confirmed the location at mile marker 76, confirmed every detail she told Rocky except one. Willa hadn't died at the hospital 3 days later. She'd died at the scene, trapped in her overturned vehicle for 6 hours, while rescuers tried to reach her through the same freezing fog that's present every time she appears. The hypothermia had killed her before they could cut her free. And her last words to the first responder who reached her were, "Tell them to slow down at the curve. Tell them about the ice." Officer Michelle has since compiled a file of 47 separate reports of Willa Turner's appearances on Highway 22 between 1995 and 2023. Every report follows the same pattern. Young female hitchhiker appears during freezing fog near mile marker 76, warns drivers about accidents or dangerous conditions, provides details that prove accurate, and vanishes from locked vehicles. In 32 of these incidents, her warnings directly prevented accidents. The Oregon Department of Transportation has since installed additional warning signs at mile marker 76, improved the banking of the curve, and enhanced the ice prevention measures. But locals say Willa still appears on nights when the freezing fog rolls in. Phoenix, Alessandra, and Rocky have all spoken publicly about their experiences. and all three maintain that Willa Turner saved their lives. They visited her grave at Salem Pioneer Cemetery, left flowers, thanked her for her intervention. The address she gave Alessandra, 847 Madison Street, when mapped correctly, isn't in the river, but would be the location of Willa's childhood home, demolished in 1998 to make room for a parking structure. She's still trying to go home, still taking rides from strangers, still warning people about the ice and the fog and the curve that killed her 29 years ago. And on nights when the freezing fog settles over Santiam Pass, when the temperature drops below zero and visibility disappears, drivers report seeing her still, standing on the shoulder near mile marker 76, thumb out, waiting for someone to stop, waiting for another chance to save a life she couldn't save herself. Jace Hoffman keeps the photographs in a locked drawer in his garage, and he only looks at them when he's had too much to drink and needs to remind himself that what happened on Bridge Creek Road in October 2023 was real. The photographs show things that shouldn't exist. Odometer readings that don't make sense. GPS tracks that form impossible loops. Vehicle damage that can't be explained by any normal driving conditions. But more than the photographs, what keeps Jace up at night are the missing hours. The way 5 men experienced completely different timelines while driving the same 12-mile stretch of abandoned logging road. And the way they all came out changed in ways they're still trying to understand. The hunting trip had been planned for months. Jace and 4 friends from Portland making their annual elk hunting expedition to the remote country around Mitchell, Oregon. Davis Park, Cairo Williams, Truett Mason, and Hassan Boyd had been making this trip with Jace for 6 years, always staying at the same campsite near Bridge Creek Wilderness, always taking the same routes through the Ochoco Mountains. They were experienced hunters, comfortable in the backcountry, the kind of men who knew how to read terrain and weather, who carried GPS units and satellite phones and never took unnecessary risks. They'd heard stories about Bridge Creek Road. Locals in Mitchell warned them it was easy to get disoriented out there, that the old logging roads crisscrossed in confusing patterns. But they'd driven it dozens of times without incident. October 15th, 2023. Started as a perfect hunting day. Cold but clear, fresh snow on the ground, making tracking easy. The 5 men had split up at dawn, planning to meet back at their trucks by 3 p.m. at the Bridge Creek Road junction with Forest Service Road 2630. Jace was the first to arrive, around 2:45 p.m., and he noticed the fog rolling in from the valleys, thick gray-white fog that seemed to pour between the trees like liquid. By 3:15, all 5 trucks were parked in a line, and the men were loading their gear, discussing the day's hunt, when Davis pointed to something in the fog. "You guys see that?" Davis asked, voice uncertain, and the others turned to look where he was pointing. Through the fog, maybe 200 yards into the forest, there were lights. Bright, pulsing lights that seemed to hover at about head height, moving slowly through the trees. Truett's first thought was other hunters with headlamps, maybe search and rescue doing a training exercise. But the lights were too bright for headlamps, and they moved in a way that didn't match human walking. They pulsed and swayed, appeared and disappeared, moved vertically as well as horizontally. "Could be drones," Hassan suggested, pulling out his phone to take video, but his phone's camera wouldn't focus properly, showing only blurred streaks of light. All 5 men tried to photograph the lights, and all 5 phones malfunctioned in the same way, cameras either refusing to work or producing images that were completely corrupted. Cairo grabbed his truck's dash cam, which had been recording their arrival, and played back the last few minutes of footage. The lights were visible on the recording, but they looked different on screen, more geometric, moving in patterns that seemed almost mathematical. And there was something else. A low-frequency sound that the camera had picked up but the men hadn't consciously heard. A thrumming pulse that made your teeth ache when you listened to it through the truck's speakers. The fog was getting thicker, and the lights were getting closer. The men made the decision that they all later regretted. They would drive out in convoy, stay together, follow Bridge Creek Road back to Highway 26, which was only 12 miles away. Simple plan, impossible to get lost. They'd done it hundreds of times. Jace took the lead in his Ford, followed by Davis in his Chevy, then Cairo, Hassan, and Truett, bringing up the rear. They maintained visual contact, keeping about 30 feet between vehicles, traveling at maybe 15 miles per hour because the fog had reduced visibility to almost nothing. What happened over the next hours has been reconstructed from the men's individual testimonies, their vehicle data recorders, and recovered dashcam footage. And the more you examine the evidence, the less sense it makes. Jace's account. He drove for what felt like about 30 minutes, maintaining constant radio contact with Davis behind him, occasionally seeing Davis's headlights in his rearview mirror through the fog. The road seemed strange. He kept passing landmarks he didn't remember. The curves felt wrong, but he attributed it to the fog playing tricks. His GPS showed him moving along Bridge Creek Road, making steady progress toward the highway. He emerged from the fog at the Highway 26 junction at what his truck's clock said was 4:47 p.m., pulled over, and waited for the others. Davis's account. He followed Jace's taillights for what felt like maybe an hour, maintaining radio contact. But Jace's voice sounded strange over the radio, distorted and echoing. Davis kept seeing the lights in the fog around him. Pulsing lights that seemed to pace his vehicle, appearing on both sides of the road. His GPS started showing impossible things. His position jumping miles in seconds, showing him on roads that weren't on any map. Displaying his altitude as changing hundreds of feet, even though the road was relatively flat. When Davis finally emerged from the fog at Highway 26, his truck's clock said 7:32 p.m., nearly 3 hours after they'd started. And Jace was sitting there in his truck, looking confused and asking Davis where the hell he'd been. Cairo's experience was worse. He maintained visual contact with Davis's taillights for the first few minutes, then the fog seemed to thicken and Davis's truck disappeared. Cairo continued forward, calling on the radio, getting no response except static and occasional fragments of voices that might have been the others, but sounded wrong. Distorted, like recordings played at the wrong speed. The lights appeared directly in front of his truck multiple times, forcing him to stop, and when they moved away, they left after images on his retinas that lasted for minutes. Cairo's dashcam footage from this period shows something that multiple video analysts have examined and cannot explain. The road ahead of him curves left, but his GPS overlay shows him turning right. And in several frames, the trees alongside the road appear in impossible positions, suggesting his truck is somehow in two places simultaneously. Hassan and Truett had the most disturbing experience because they stayed together, maintained visual contact throughout, and emerged with matching testimonies that directly contradict the physical evidence. Both men swear they drove for no more than 45 minutes, that they followed Cairo's taillights the entire time, that they never lost sight of each other. But Hassan's truck clock showed 9:18 p.m. when they reached Highway 26, over 5 hours after departure. And Truett's showed 11:47 p.m., more than 8 hours. Both men's GPS units had recorded tracks showing they'd driven 127 miles and 203 miles respectively, despite the road being only 12 miles long. Hassan's dashcam footage shows Truett's truck behind him for most of the drive. But the timestamp on Hassan's footage doesn't match the timestamp on Truett's dashcam footage of the same events. They're offset by hours, showing the same moments happening at different times. When all 5 men finally reunited at the Highway 26 junction, they discovered other impossibilities. Jace's truck looked normal, barely any dirt on it, odometers showing he'd traveled 11.8 miles. Davis's truck had accumulated an impossible amount of road wear. Chipped paint, cracked windshield, tires worn down as if he'd driven hundreds of miles on rough roads. Cairo's truck had tree branches embedded in the undercarriage, branches from trees that don't grow in that region of Oregon. And his paint was covered in a fine orange dust that later testing identified as decomposed volcanic tuff, similar to material found in the painted hills 20 miles away. Hassan's truck had normal wear except for one detail. His hood was dented inward, as if something large had struck it from above. But Hassan has zero memory of any impact. Truett's truck had the most disturbing evidence. His odometer showed he'd traveled 340 miles. His fuel tank was nearly empty despite being full when they started. And his tires were completely bald, worn smooth as if he'd driven thousands of miles on pavement. The men called the Wheeler County Sheriff's Department, gave statements, submitted to sobriety tests, which they all passed. Their vehicles were examined by mechanics who confirmed the physical evidence was real, the wear, the damage, the odometer, readings, but couldn't explain how it happened in the time frame involved. The GPS tracks were analyzed by mapping experts who confirmed they showed impossible routes, roads that exist on no maps, coordinates that would place the trucks in areas of dense forest where no roads exist. The dashcam footage was examined by video forensics specialists who found no evidence of tampering, but couldn't explain the timestamp discrepancies or the anomalous content. The story gained attention locally, then regionally, then nationally as various experts tried to explain what happened. Theories ranged from mass hallucination to carbon monoxide poisoning, to some kind of natural electromagnetic phenomenon in the area. The U.S. Forest Service closed Bridge Creek Road pending investigation, and a team from Oregon State University spent 2 weeks in the area with sophisticated equipment trying to detect anything unusual. They found elevated electromagnetic readings in several locations, unusual mineral deposits that created localized magnetic anomalies, and what one researcher described as atmospheric conditions that don't match any known weather patterns. But none of it explained what happened to 5 experienced hunters on a 12-mile stretch of logging road. The psychological effects on the men have been profound. Davis refuses to drive alone anymore, says he can't trust that time is passing normally, that he'll check his clock obsessively on any drive longer than a few minutes. Cairo has recurring dreams about still being on that road, still driving through endless fog, seeing those lights moving through the trees. Hassan and Truett get into arguments about their shared experience because despite being together, their memories of specific moments don't align, like they experience the same events from different timelines. Jace, who had the most normal experience, sometimes feels guilty about it, wonders if the others resent him for getting out so easily. There have been follow-up investigations, multiple return trips to the area with researchers and journalists, attempts to recreate the conditions. Nothing anomalous has been detected. Nothing unexplained has occurred. The road is just a road. The fog is just fog. And the 5 men are left with their impossible evidence and their conflicting memories. Local logging companies have reported equipment malfunctions in the area, GPS failures, unusual radio interference, but nothing approaching what the hunters experienced. Some locals in Mitchell say the area has always been strange, that Bridge Creek Wilderness has a reputation for disorienting hikers, that people have reported losing time or finding themselves miles from where they thought they were. The most disturbing detail, the one that keeps Jace drinking alone in his garage looking at those photographs, came from analyzing all 5 dashcam recordings simultaneously. A researcher at Portland State University synchronized the videos using audio markers and timestamp data and discovered something that shouldn't be possible. For a brief period, exactly 17 seconds on all 5 recordings, the videos show all 5 trucks driving on the same stretch of road at the same time, visible to each other in a convoy formation. But according to the truck clocks and GPS data, these 17 seconds occurred at 5 different times, spread across more than 8 hours. It's as if all 5 men briefly synchronized into the same timeline before splitting apart again, each continuing through their own individual experience of the same road. Jace doesn't hunt anymore. None of them do. They still meet sometimes, usually at a bar in Portland, and they talk about what happened, trying to make sense of it, trying to convince each other and themselves that it was real. They've been contacted by people who claim to have had similar experiences on remote roads across the Pacific Northwest. Time losses, impossible distances traveled, lights in the fog that seem to follow vehicles. There's a pattern emerging, a picture of something that exists in the fog in the forests, something that creates pockets where normal physics don't apply, where time moves differently, where 12 miles can become hundreds and 8 hours can pass in what feels like minutes. And the most terrifying part, the part none of them wants to say out loud, is that they don't know if they ever really left that road. Because sometimes Jace looks at his truck's odometer and the number is different from what he remembers. Or he'll check the date and realize he's lost hours he can't account for. And he wonders if October 15th, 2023 ever actually ended. If he's still driving through that fog on Bridge Creek Road, still seeing those lights in the trees, still trying to find his way back to a highway he's never going to reach. The Wellington disaster is something most people have never heard of. But if you drive Highway 2 through Stevens Pass in Washington, you're traveling directly over one of the deadliest avalanche sites in American history. On March 1st, 1910, a massive snowslide buried 2 trains carrying 96 passengers and crew, killing all but 23 people in a matter of seconds. The town of Wellington was so traumatized by the event that residents renamed it Ty, trying to erase the association with death. And eventually, the town was abandoned entirely. But Carmen Vasquez, a historian specializing in Pacific Northwest disasters, will tell you that some things can't be erased just by changing names on maps. Carmen has been documenting modern encounters near the Wellington site since 2019. And what started as academic research into local folklore has become something she can no longer explain with rational analysis. She's collected testimony from 17 different drivers who've experienced what she calls temporal overlaps on Highway 2 near milepost 58. Always during heavy fog or snowstorms, always during conditions that mirror the night of the original disaster. The accounts share disturbing similarities. Period-accurate sounds, visual manifestations of people in 1910s clothing, and most troubling, physical interactions that leave marks on modern drivers that medical professionals cannot explain. The first case Carmen investigated was Emily Torres, a Seattle social worker driving home from a conference in Spokane in February 2022. Emily had driven Highway 2 dozens of times and knew the Stevens Pass section well, knew to be cautious in winter conditions. That night, around 10 p.m., she drove into what she initially thought was just heavy mountain fog, the kind that settles into valleys and reduces visibility to a few car lengths. But as she continued, the fog took on a strange quality. It felt older somehow, heavier, and it carried a smell she couldn't identify. Something like coal smoke mixed with snow and something metallic. Emily's car radio started picking up interference, crackling static that occasionally resolved into what sounded like voices speaking in patterns that didn't match modern speech rhythms. She was reaching to turn off the radio when she heard it, a sound so massive and terrible that her first thought was that the mountain itself was collapsing. It was a roaring, grinding noise, like thunder mixed with the sound of trees being shattered, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding her vehicle. Emily slammed on her brakes, certain that an avalanche was about to sweep across the highway. And in the fog ahead of her, she saw movement. Massive, white, rushing toward her like a wall of death. But the wave never hit. It stopped maybe 20 feet in front of her car, hung there impossibly in the air. And Emily realized she was looking at snow suspended in fog, held in a position that defied gravity. Through the suspended snow, she could see figures, dozens of them, people dressed in clothing from another era, standing in the fog as if they were standing on ground that no longer existed. They were looking around in confusion, some pointing toward the suspended avalanche, some reaching out to each other. And Emily could see their mouths moving as if they were speaking or screaming. But she heard nothing except that terrible grinding roar. The moment lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though Emily's dash cam later showed it was closer to 3 minutes. And then everything disappeared, the suspended snow, the figures, the sound. And she was alone on an empty highway in normal mountain fog. Emily drove to the nearest town in shock, called 911, and when the Washington State Patrol arrived to take her statement, the officer's expression changed when she described what she'd seen. "You saw the Wellington passengers?" the officer said quietly. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." The second case was more disturbing because it involved physical contact. Holly Kim was driving east on Highway 2 in early March 2023, almost exactly 113 years after the original disaster. Holly had recently moved to Washington from California and didn't know the history of the pass she was driving through. The snowstorm hit suddenly, the kind of whiteout conditions where you can't tell where the road ends and the sky begins. Holly slowed to barely moving, considering pulling over to wait it out, when she saw someone standing on the side of the road. It was a man in what looked like a conductor's uniform, waving his arms frantically, clearly in distress. Holly's first instinct was to stop and help. The man appeared to be in serious trouble, possibly hypothermic. But something about the scene felt wrong. The man wasn't dressed for the weather. His uniform looked thin, inadequate for a blizzard, and as her headlights swept across him, she noticed his clothes were from a different era entirely, with details that looked like something from old photographs. Holly stopped anyway, rolled down her window, and shouted to ask if he needed help. The man rushed toward her car, moving with desperate urgency, and grabbed her arm through the open window. His hand was so cold it burned, cold beyond anything Holly had ever experienced, and his face when he leaned close to her window was terrified in a way that transcended normal fear. "Tell them about the slide," he said, his voice sounding strange, like it was coming from far away, despite him being inches from her face. "Tell them it's coming from the mountain. Tell them to run now. They don't have time to wait." Holly jerked her arm back, felt the man's grip tighten for a moment, and then he was gone. Simply vanished into the snow as if he'd never been there. She quickly rolled up her window, heart hammering, and looked at her arm where he'd grabbed her. There were marks, clear, handprint-shaped marks. But they weren't bruises. They were frostbite burns, severe ones, the kind that only form after prolonged exposure to extreme cold. Holly drove straight to the nearest emergency room where medical staff confirmed the frostbite was real, was severe enough to require treatment, and couldn't have formed in the few seconds of contact Holly described. The burns suggested her arm had been exposed to temperatures well below zero for at least 10 minutes. Carmen interviewed Holly extensively, showed her photographs from the Wellington disaster's aftermath, and Holly immediately identified the man who'd grabbed her. His name was Joseph Pettit, a conductor on one of the buried trains, and his body had been recovered 3 days after the avalanche. Historical records show that Pettit had been one of the last people to die, had survived the initial impact and spent hours trying to rescue trapped passengers before succumbing to hypothermia and injuries. His last recorded words to rescuers were, "Tell them to run. Tell them the mountain is still moving." The most recent and most thoroughly documented case happened just 8 months ago, in February 2025, and it involved multiple witnesses experiencing the same phenomenon simultaneously. A tour bus carrying 23 tourists was traveling through Stevens Pass during what the driver, a man named Wilson, described as the worst conditions I've seen in 20 years of driving this route. The fog and snow were so thick that Wilson had slowed to less than 10 miles per hour, and he was considering stopping entirely when the sound started. Everyone on the bus heard it. The screaming, the sound of metal tearing, the roar of an avalanche, and underneath it all, a train whistle blowing in desperate warning. The sounds were so loud, so immediate, that several passengers ducked down in their seats, convinced they were about to be hit. Wilson's dashcam captured the audio, and when analyzed later, experts confirmed the train whistle matched recordings of Great Northern Railway locomotives from the 1910s era. More disturbing, the screaming captured on the audio included period-specific English phrases and what sounded like multiple different languages, matching the documented nationalities of the Wellington victims. But it wasn't just sound. 12 passengers reported seeing figures outside the bus windows, people in old-fashioned clothing, pressing their faces against the glass, mouths open in silent screams. 3 passengers took photographs, and while the images are blurred and indistinct, forensic analysis shows anomalies that multiple experts have examined and cannot explain. The figures in the photographs appear translucent but cast shadows, show up on digital sensors, but not in the same way living humans register. And their clothing matches styles and fabrics documented in Wellington disaster photographs. The most disturbing moment came when one of the figures appeared to pass through the bus's metal exterior. A passenger named Dorothy, sitting near the front, screamed when a woman in a long, dark dress materialized in the aisle beside her. The woman was soaking wet, her hair plastered to her face, and she was holding a small child wrapped in blankets. Dorothy described the woman's face as absolutely terrified, but also confused, like she didn't understand where she was or what was happening to her. The woman reached out toward Dorothy, seemed to be trying to hand her the child, and Dorothy, acting on instinct, reached back. Their hands never touched because the woman and child faded before contact could be made. But Dorothy felt the cold, that same intense, burning cold that Holly had experienced. Thermal imaging from the bus's heating system shows a temperature drop of 47 degrees in the area where the woman appeared, a localized cold spot that lasted for approximately 4 minutes before dissipating. Dorothy later worked with Carmen to identify who she'd seen, and they found a match in the casualty list: Anna Berg, age 28, and her son Eric, age 3, both killed in the avalanche. Historical accounts describe Anna as having been found still holding her son, having wrapped him in blankets and covered his body with her own in a futile attempt to protect him. Carmen's research has led her to a disturbing conclusion that she's reluctant to state publicly, but confirmed in our interview. The Wellington site isn't haunted in the traditional sense. It's something more complex and more terrible. She believes that the extreme trauma and terror of the disaster, combined with the specific meteorological conditions that caused it, created what she describes as a temporal scar in that location. when modern weather patterns mirror the conditions present on March 1st, 1910. Heavy snow, dense fog, specific temperature and pressure combinations, the barrier between past and present becomes permeable. The victims of Wellington aren't appearing as ghosts in the sense of spirits of the dead. They're appearing as temporal echoes, moments of the past bleeding through into the present when conditions align perfectly. This would explain why witnesses report such specific details, period-accurate sounds, clothing, even the languages spoken, because they're not witnessing recreations or impressions. They're witnessing the actual event playing out across time. What makes this particularly chilling is Carmen's discovery that the encounters are becoming more frequent and more intense. In the 1950s through 1990s, she's found only scattered reports, maybe one every few years. But from 2000 onward, the frequency has increased, and since 2020, there have been reports almost monthly during winter conditions. The manifestations are also becoming more physical, more people reporting being touched, more evidence of temperature drops, more physical marks left on witnesses. Carmen's most controversial theory is that the temporal scar is widening, that each modern encounter strengthens it somehow, making it easier for the past to break through. She points to the bus incident as evidence. 23 people experiencing the same manifestation simultaneously suggests the phenomenon is becoming more stable, more able to sustain itself across multiple observers. If the pattern continues, Carmen believes we could reach a point where the 1910 avalanche doesn't just echo through time, but actually intersects with the present in a sustained way. The Washington Department of Transportation officially denies any unusual activity on Highway 2. But Carmen has obtained internal documents showing they've installed additional monitoring equipment near milepost 58, specifically recording audio, temperature, and electromagnetic readings during winter storms. They're collecting data on something, even if they won't publicly acknowledge what. Local emergency services have also quietly implemented a protocol for Stevens Pass that includes questions about temporal displacement experiences in their incident report forms. For drivers who regularly travel Highway 2, the Wellington encounters have become an unspoken reality. Most won't talk about it openly, but they'll tell you privately about the times they've heard the train whistle in the fog, or seen figures standing where no road exists, or felt that terrible burning cold seep into their vehicles during snowstorms. They'll tell you that when conditions are bad enough, when the fog is thick and the snow is heavy and you're driving through Stevens Pass around milepost 58, you're not alone on that road. You're sharing the space with 96 people who died in terror 115 years ago, who are still experiencing those final moments, still trying to warn others, still reaching out for help that will never come. And every year, as the temporal scar widens, they're getting closer to breaking through completely. The Oregon Department of Transportation's incident report from September 23, 2023, lists it as a routine wildfire-related highway closure. Interstate 5 near Medford shut down for approximately 6 hours due to superfog conditions created by the nearby Siskiyou fire. What the official report doesn't mention are the 18 drivers who were trapped in that superfog between mile markers 24 and 31. And what they all saw moving through the darkness during those 6 hours when visibility dropped to absolute zero and the world outside their vehicles ceased to follow any recognizable rules. Raylan Martinez was the first vehicle to get trapped, and her dashcam footage, later subpoenaed by investigators, shows the exact moment when driving conditions went from merely dangerous to completely impossible. Raylan had been heading south from Portland to visit family in Sacramento, had been monitoring the fire reports all day and knew she was cutting it close. But the highway had been open, and she'd thought she could make it through before conditions worsened. At 12:47 p.m., her dashcam shows normal highway driving, traffic moving at reduced speed due to smoke haze. Visibility may be a quarter mile. The sun visible as an orange disk through the particulate-filled air. Then, at 12:48 p.m., everything changes. The smoke doesn't gradually thicken. It hits like a physical wall, and within 3 seconds, Raylan's visibility drops from a quarter mile to less than 10 feet. The dashcam's automatic exposure compensation struggles to adjust, cycling through different settings as it tries to capture anything in the orange-brown murk that has completely enveloped the highway. Raylan's voice on the audio. Oh my God, I can't see anything." Followed by the sound of her braking hard, feeling her car slide slightly on the pavement despite the ABS system engaging. She comes to a complete stop in what she hopes is still her lane, puts on her hazard lights, and sits there with her heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. Her cell phone shows 1 bar of signal, flickering in and out. Not enough to make a call. The smoke is so thick it's seeping into her vehicle despite the air conditioning being set to recirculate. And the smell. Witnesses would later uniformly describe it as wrong. Not just burning wood, but something chemical. Something that made your eyes water and your throat close and your head feel foggy and disconnected. Behind Raylan, 17 other vehicles came to stops over the next 8 minutes as they drove into the superfog bank. Some managed to pull onto the shoulder, others stopped in lanes, and a few rear-ended vehicles ahead of them at low speeds, causing minor damage but no injuries. By 1 p.m., all 18 vehicles were stationary, strung out along a 7-mile stretch of Interstate 5, completely isolated from each other by the impenetrable smoke fog mixture. Raylan tried her phone repeatedly, managed to send one text message to her sister Sayomara that read, "Stuck in fog, I-5 can't see, can't breathe," before losing signal entirely. Other drivers had similar experiences. Brief moments of connectivity followed by nothing, as if the superfog was blocking not just light, but radio waves, cellular signals, everything that connected them to the world beyond the smoke. For the first 20 minutes, most drivers did what Raylan did. Sat in their vehicles, waited for conditions to improve, tried not to panic. Carolina Bishop, 3 cars behind Raylan, though neither knew the other existed, later told investigators that she spent those first 20 minutes doing breathing exercises, reminding herself that this was just weather, just smoke and fog, that it would clear eventually. Dylan Foster, driving a semi loaded with electronics and stopped nearly a mile ahead of Raylan, used the time to log the incident with his company, sending messages via his truck's satellite system before that too stopped working. Uriah Chen, traveling with his wife Matilda and their infant daughter Mallory, focused on keeping his family calm, playing music from his phone, trying to make it seem like an adventure rather than an increasingly frightening situation. The first indication that something was wrong beyond just the superfog came at approximately 1:22 p.m., according to multiple dashcam timestamps. Raylan's footage shows it clearly. A shape moving through the smoke outside her driver's side window. Not drifting the way smoke and fog drift, but moving deliberately, passing alongside her car with what appears to be purpose. The shape is dark, darker than the surrounding smoke, and humanoid but wrong somehow. Too tall, proportions not quite right, moving in a way that doesn't match human walking. Raylan's audio captures her sharp intake of breath, then silence as she watches the shape pass, then her whispered, "What the fuck was that?" Carolina saw it 2 minutes later, documented on her dash cam, and her reaction was more visceral, screaming, locking her doors even though they were already locked, scrambling for her phone to try to call 911 even though she had no signal. The shape passed alongside her passenger side, and Carolina later swore under oath that it turned its head to look at her, that she saw a face through her window despite the smoke. a face that looked burned, like someone who'd been in a fire but still moving, still watching. Over the next hour, all 18 drivers reported seeing the figure, most multiple times. The testimonies are remarkably consistent. A tall figure, at least 7 feet, moving against the traffic flow which should have been impossible since the highway was completely closed. The figure appeared to move from south to north, passing each vehicle systematically, taking its time, and those who saw it closely described the same details. Severely burned skin visible through the smoke. Clothing that might have been some kind of uniform but was charred beyond recognition. And most disturbing, an interest in the vehicles it passed, as if it was looking for something or someone specific. Dylan's truck had the most sophisticated camera system, with multiple angles recorded simultaneously, and his footage became the centerpiece of later investigations. At 2:13 p.m., his side view camera captures the figure approaching his truck from behind, and the quality is clear enough to see details that other cameras missed. The figure's face is visible for approximately 4 seconds, and forensic analysis of those frames shows features consistent with severe burn injuries, tissue damage, exposed areas that should have been fatal, and most troubling, eyes that appeared to be tracking the camera, aware it was being recorded. When the figure reaches Dylan's driver's side door, it stops, stands there for nearly 30 seconds, and appears to be examining the truck. Dylan, unaware of its presence because his attention was on comforting his terrified wife and crying infant, didn't look out his window during this time. But the camera captured everything. The figure's hand, if it could be called a hand, reaches toward the truck's mirror, and when it makes contact, something extraordinary happens. The camera picks up a bright flash like an electrical discharge, and the mirror suddenly shows a layer of what looks like soot or ash, a handprint burned into the metal. The figure then moves on, continuing north along the line of trapped vehicles, and Dylan remained unaware of what had been standing outside his door until he reviewed the footage days later. Multiple drivers reported the same phenomenon. After the figure passed their vehicles, they found handprints on their mirrors, windows, or door handles. Not normal handprints that could be wiped away, but burned into the surface, etched there by heat so intense it left permanent marks on metal and glass. Helena Park, driving a Honda sedan, found handprints on both her driver's side window and her rear passenger window, suggesting the figure had circled her entire vehicle while she sat inside, oblivious. Azael Wright's dash cam captured the moment the figure pressed its hand against his windshield, and the audio picked up a sound like sizzling, like meat hitting a hot pan, as the handprint burned into the glass. The psychological terror was compounded by the isolation. Drivers could see the figure, could see the evidence of its presence, but couldn't communicate with each other, couldn't call for help, couldn't escape because driving in zero visibility meant certain accidents. They were trapped, forced to sit in their vehicles while something impossible moved among them, touching their cars, leaving its marks, watching them through windows with eyes that shouldn't have been able to see anything through the dense smoke fog. At 2:47 p.m., Raylan's dashcam captured what became the most analyzed piece of footage from the entire incident. The figure approached her car for the second time, and this time it stopped directly in front of her vehicle, facing her windshield. For 43 seconds, it stood there, and despite the smoke, despite the poor visibility, Raylin could see it clearly. Her audio captures her sobbing, begging it to go away. And then she makes a decision that probably saved her from a complete psychological breakdown. She closes her eyes, refuses to look, and keeps them closed for the next several minutes. When she finally opens them, the figure is gone, but her windshield has a large handprint burned into it, right in her line of sight. And there's something else. A pattern in the soot on her hood that looks like writing, like someone used their finger to trace letters. But the language or symbols aren't recognizable. The super fog began to clear around 6 p.m., dissipating as quickly as it had formed. Within 30 minutes, visibility had improved enough for vehicles to start moving, and Oregon State Police arrived to find all 18 vehicles still in position, their occupants in various states of shock and terror. Officer Sam Brixton was first on scene and immediately recognized something was wrong. Drivers who should have been relieved to see help arriving were instead reluctant to leave their vehicles, some crying, some in apparent dissociation, all of them traumatized by something beyond just being stuck in bad weather. The physical evidence was undeniable. All 18 vehicles showed burned handprints on various surfaces, and forensic analysis confirmed the marks were created by extreme heat, temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to permanently alter metal and glass. The patterns in the soot on several vehicles were photographed and analyzed by linguists and cryptographers. But no consensus was ever reached about whether they constituted actual writing or were random patterns created by the smoke. The incident gained national attention when a researcher discovered that a semi-truck had jackknifed and burned on that exact stretch of Interstate 5 3 years earlier, killing the driver, a man named Wesley Vaughn. The accident had been particularly horrific. The truck's load included chemicals that created an intense fire, and Wesley had been trapped in the cab for approximately 40 minutes before the fire department could reach him. Witnesses to that earlier accident reported hearing him screaming, trying to escape, and the final official report noted that he'd suffered severe burns over 95% of his body before succumbing to smoke inhalation. When investigators showed Raylan and the other drivers photographs of Wesley Vaughn from before his death, 14 of the 18 identified him as matching the figure they'd seen in the superfog. The facial features, the approximate height, even details of his build matched their descriptions. But Wesley had been dead for 3 years, and his body had been cremated after the accident. Whatever was moving through that superfog, touching vehicles, watching drivers through the smoke, looked like him but couldn't be him. The psychological damage to the 18 drivers has been profound and lasting. 5 required hospitalization for severe anxiety attacks in the days following the incident. 7 sought ongoing therapy for trauma-related symptoms. 3, including Raylan, developed such severe anxiety about driving that they sold their vehicles and now rely on other transportation. The common thread in their testimonies is a conviction that what they experienced wasn't a hallucination or mass hysteria, but a genuine encounter with something that shouldn't exist. A victim of fire and smoke, trapped in the same conditions that killed him, endlessly reliving his final terrified moments and reaching out to the living in a desperate attempt to connect, to be seen, to matter. The burned handprints remained on the vehicles, permanent reminders of that September afternoon. Some drivers had them removed, paying for new mirrors and windows, unable to tolerate the physical evidence of what they'd experienced. Others, like Uriah, kept them, seeing them as proof that they're not crazy, that what happened was real. The Oregon Department of Transportation added unexplained phenomena to its official incident classification system following the superfog event, acknowledging that some aspects of the incident could not be explained by conventional means, while still refusing to use words like haunted or supernatural in official documentation. What keeps investigators awake at night is the question of why that day. Why those specific drivers? The superfog had occurred before in that area, created by the same combination of wildfire smoke and atmospheric moisture, but only on September 23, 2023. The 3rd anniversary of Wesley Vaughn's death. Did witnesses report the figure? As if the super fog created a window, A brief moment when the barrier between the dead and the living became permeable, when a man who died in terror and agony could reach back across that divide and touch, just for a few hours, the world he'd been torn from in flames. The Washington State Patrol keeps a sealed file on Highway 20's Deception Pass Bridge incidents, and Officer Seven Park has been adding to it monthly since January 2023. The file contains transcripts of phone calls that shouldn't exist, recordings of voices that belong to people who are still alive, and testimony from drivers who received warnings from themselves about deaths that haven't happened yet. What started as isolated oddities has become a pattern so disturbing that local cellular providers have been quietly asked to flag any calls originating from specific numbers, while those same numbers are simultaneously active elsewhere. A technical impossibility that keeps happening anyway. The bridge itself has always carried weight, spanning Deception Pass between Whidbey Island and Fidalgo Island, 180 feet above waters known for dangerous currents and frequent drownings. Since its construction in 1935, it's been a site of numerous suicides, accidents, and disappearances. But the phone call phenomenon is recent, beginning in late 2022, and it follows a specific pattern that Officer Park has documented with increasing concern. It only happens during fog, specifically maritime fog that rises from Puget Sound and creates the visual effect of the bridge disappearing into white void above and below, suspended in nothingness. And it only happens to solo drivers crossing at night. Alaya Rodriguez was the first documented case, though Officer Park suspects there were earlier incidents that went unreported because the witnesses thought they were losing their minds. Alaya was driving south on Highway 20 around 11 p.m. on January 18, 2023, returning home to Oak Harbor after visiting friends in Anacortes. The fog rolled in as she approached the bridge, the kind of dense maritime fog that carries the smell of salt and seaweed and seems to muffle sound in unsettling ways. Alaya's phone was sitting in her cup holder, connected to her car's Bluetooth for navigation, when it started ringing with an incoming call. The caller ID showed her own name and her own number. Alaya's first thought was spam, some kind of spoofing scam where criminals fake your own number to trick you into answering. She declined the call and continued driving, visibility dropping to maybe 50 feet as she started across the bridge. Her phone rang again immediately, same caller ID, her own name staring back at her from the screen. Alaya answered this time, expecting a robocall or a scammer's pitch. But what she heard instead made her nearly drive off the bridge. It was her own voice. Not similar, not someone who sounded like her, but her exact voice, down to the slight rasp she'd had since a childhood bout of strep throat, the way she pronounced certain words, the breathing pattern. "Alaya, listen to me," her voice said from the phone, urgent and terrified. "Don't cross the bridge. Turn around right now. There's going to be an accident at the north end. A truck is going to jackknife. In 3 minutes, and you're going to hit it. You're going to die. I'm calling from..." The line went dead. Alaya sat frozen, phone in her shaking hand, trying to process what she'd just heard. She was already on the bridge, maybe a third of the way across, and turning around wasn't an option. The lanes were too narrow, traffic behind her, nowhere to safely stop. Her hands tightened on the wheel and she slowed down, eyes scanning the fog ahead for any sign of the truck her other voice, had warned her about. The next 2 minutes felt like hours. Every set of taillights ahead making her heart jump, every shadow in the fog, potentially the accident waiting to kill her. She reached the north end of the bridge at slow speed, hyper alert, and there was no accident. No jackknifed truck, no dangerous situation, just normal late-night traffic thinning out as vehicles dispersed into the darkness beyond the bridge. Alaya pulled into a parking area overlooking the water, hands trembling, and checked her phone's call history. The incoming call was listed there, time-stamped 11:17 p.m., duration 43 seconds, and the caller ID showed her own number. Alaya tried calling the number, calling herself, but it just went to her own voicemail. She sat there for 20 minutes trying to rationalize what had happened, finally deciding it must have been some elaborate prank, maybe someone using AI to clone her voice, though she couldn't imagine how or why. She drove home, shaken but trying to convince herself it was explainable. The next morning, checking local news out of paranoid curiosity, she found a brief article about a semi-truck that had jackknifed on Highway 20 at the north end of Deception Pass Bridge at 11:43 p.m. the previous night. The truck had lost control in fog, blocked both lanes, and it took emergency crews 2 hours to clear the scene. If the accident had happened 26 minutes earlier, if it had happened at 11:17 p.m. when Alaya was crossing, she would have hit it at highway speed with zero time to react. The timing was too specific, too exact to be coincidence. Alaya reported the incident to Washington State Patrol, and that's when Officer Park started the file. Because Alaya wasn't the first person to call about strange phenomena on Deception Pass Bridge, but she was the first with a recording. Her phone had automatically saved the call to her device, and when Park listened to it, she couldn't dispute what she was hearing. It was Alaya's voice, verified by audio analysis, speaking to Alaya with information about an accident that did happen, but at a time that would have been 26 minutes in the future when the call was placed. The second documented case was Drake Sullivan in April 2023. Drake was a photographer who frequently drove Highway 20 to shoot landscapes, and he'd crossed Deception Pass Bridge hundreds of times without incident. On April 9th, around 2 a.m., he was driving home after a night photography session when maritime fog enveloped the bridge so completely that he couldn't see the roadway more than a car length ahead. His phone rang, his own number, his own name on the caller ID. Drake answered without hesitation, because his first thought was that his phone had somehow butt-dialed itself, that he'd hear ambient noise or silence. Instead, he heard himself, frantic and desperate. "Drake, you need to pull over now. Right now. Don't ask questions. Your tire's about to blow. The right rear tire has a slow leak. The bridge expansion joints are going to cause it to blow out completely. You're going to lose control. Pull over to the shoulder immediately." Drake, more shocked than skeptical, did exactly what his voice told him to do. He carefully maneuvered to the shoulder, put on his hazards, and got out to check his tires. The right rear was visibly low, and when he examined it closely with his flashlight, he found a nail embedded in the tread, barely visible, leaking air slowly but steadily. Drake called roadside assistance, had the tire changed, and drove home in a state of confused terror. The next day he took the damaged tire to a shop, and the mechanic confirmed that the tire would have failed catastrophically within the next few miles, especially under the stress of the bridge's expansion joints and the sharp curves on the north end. At highway speed, a rear tire blowout could easily cause a fatal accident, particularly in fog conditions with limited visibility. Drake had no explanation for how he'd received a call from himself warning about a problem he didn't know existed, using specific technical details he couldn't have known. Officer Park interviewed Drake, added his case to the file, and began reaching out to other patrol officers asking if they'd received similar reports. 3 additional cases surfaced from the previous 6 months. Drivers who'd received calls from their own numbers while crossing the bridge in fog, all hearing their own voices delivering urgent warnings, all experiencing situations where those warnings proved accurate and potentially life-saving. None had reported it officially because they thought they'd be dismissed as crazy or pranked. The pattern became clearer as Park investigated. The calls only occurred during specific fog conditions. The maritime fog that creates total isolation by obscuring the bridge above and below. The calls lasted between 30 seconds and 2 minutes. The warnings were always urgent, always specific, and always accurate. And most disturbing, the voices on the calls described themselves as calling from after or from ahead, or used phrases that suggested they were speaking from a point in time beyond when the call was being received. Grace Lynn Torres reported the most disturbing encounter in September 2024. She was crossing the bridge around midnight when her phone rang with her own number displayed. She answered and heard herself sobbing, barely coherent. "Gracie? I'm so sorry. I couldn't stop. You have to turn back. You can't cross tonight. Please believe me. You can't." The call cut off. Grace Lynn, terrified by the raw emotion in her own voice, made the dangerous decision to stop on the bridge itself. Pulling as far to the shoulder as possible, hazards on, trying to decide what to do. She sat there for maybe 3 minutes when a vehicle came speeding through the fog from behind. A pickup truck driving far too fast for conditions. The truck swerved at the last second, avoiding her stopped car by inches, but overcorrected and hit the bridge railing at an angle that sent it flipping over the side. Grace Lynn heard the impact, the terrible scraping sound of metal, and then silence. She called 911 immediately, but by the time rescue boats reached the wreckage, the driver, a man named Rocky Martinez, had drowned. The truck had gone through the railing at the exact spot where Grace Lynn's car would have been if she hadn't stopped. Park's investigation revealed that Rocky had been driving drunk, twice the legal limit, and would likely have crashed regardless. But if Grace Lynn had been in that specific location at that specific moment, he would have hit her car instead of going over alone. And there's a high probability she would have been pushed over the railing with him. The warning call had saved her life by having her stop at a spot that seemed dangerous, but turned out to be the only safe position to be in when Rocky's truck came through. The phone company's technical analysis of these calls has found no logical explanation. The calls register on cell towers as originating from the recipient's own phone. But simultaneously, that same phone is receiving the call, a physical impossibility. The calls don't route through the normal cellular network in any traceable way. They simply appear, exist for their duration, and end, leaving behind call records that shouldn't exist. The most chilling case is Helen Park, no relation to Officer 7 Park, who received a call from herself in March 2025 while crossing the bridge in fog. Helen answered and heard her own voice, calm but sad, saying only, "I'm calling to say goodbye. I want you to know that I don't blame you for what happens. The fog was too thick. You couldn't have seen him. It's not your fault." Then the line went dead. Helen, completely confused and frightened, drove across the bridge at reduced speed, eyes scanning the fog for any hazard, but reached the other side without incident. Nothing happened that night. Helen reported the call to authorities, was interviewed by Officer Park, but there was no accident, no explanation. Helen went home shaken, but physically fine. 3 weeks later, Helen was crossing the bridge again during daytime, clear conditions, no fog, when a jogger darted out from the pedestrian walkway into the roadway. Helen swerved, barely missing him, but her car clipped the bridge railing and spun. She survived with minor injuries, but the incident traumatized her deeply. The jogger, a man who'd climbed over from the walkway in what appeared to be a suicide attempt, survived as well. But Helen couldn't stop thinking about the call, about her own voice saying, "It's not your fault." Officer Park's working theory one she barely admits even to herself, is that Deception Pass Bridge has become a temporal anomaly during specific fog conditions. The bridge literally disappears into white void during maritime fog, suspended between visible water and visible sky. And perhaps that physical isolation creates a kind of temporal isolation as well. Moments become unstable. Past and future bleed together. And somehow the desperation of near-death experiences, the intense desire to warn oneself, to change outcomes, punches through that temporal barrier. The calls are coming from versions of the drivers who experienced or will experience the accidents and deaths they're warning about. They're calling from timelines where they didn't get the warning, where the crash happened, where they died or nearly died. And somehow they're reaching back, or sideways or across, to the moment before the decision point, trying to change their own fate. Most succeed. Some, like Helen, receive warnings about events that seem not to happen. But Officer Park suspects those warnings are about potential timelines, accidents that are avoided not by the specific warning, but by the heightened awareness the call creates. The file keeps growing. Park now receives reports monthly, sometimes weekly during particularly foggy periods. The Washington State Department of Transportation has quietly installed additional signage warning drivers to exercise extreme caution on the bridge during fog conditions, though they don't mention the real reason. Cellular providers have flagged the bridge location in their systems, but cannot explain or prevent the anomalous calls. And drivers who cross regularly have started sharing warnings among themselves. If your phone rings on Deception Pass Bridge and your own name shows up as caller ID, answer it immediately. Because you're about to get information that could save your life. Delivered by the only person you should always trust, yourself. Calling from a future you need to avoid. The city of Forest Grove, Oregon, had always been quiet. The kind of small college town where the biggest news was usually related to Pacific University's sports teams or debates about local zoning laws. But in March 2024, Forest Grove became the center of a phenomenon so disturbing that multiple state and federal agencies got involved. Local real estate values dropped by 18%, and 3 families permanently relocated within a month. What started as a mysterious sound became something far worse. And the 911 dispatch logs from those 3 nights in March read like something from a horror novel rather than official emergency records. The first night was March 7th, around 11:47 p.m., when the fog rolled in from the Tualatin Valley with unusual density. Fog wasn't uncommon in Forest Grove during March, but residents would later describe this particular fog as different. Thicker, somehow oppressive, settling between buildings and accumulating in yards with an almost liquid quality that made the familiar streets of their town feel alien and claustrophobic. Liana Garcia was the first to call 911. Her voice shaking as she reported, "A sound like nothing I've ever heard, like metal screaming mixed with something alive. It's hurting my ears." The dispatcher, trying to assess if this was a mechanical issue or an animal, asked Liana to describe it more specifically. But Liana just kept repeating, "It's wrong. The sound is wrong. Please send someone." Within 8 minutes, the 911 system was overwhelmed. 43 calls came in from different parts of Forest Grove, all reporting the same phenomenon. A piercing shriek that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. A sound that caused physical pain to those who heard it. Arlith Kim, a nursing student at Pacific University, described it as mechanical and organic at the same time. Like a train braking, but also like an animal dying. And it goes through your head, makes your teeth hurt. Peyton Ross, a retired firefighter who'd heard every imaginable emergency sound in his 30-year career, called 911 crying saying, "This isn't natural. This sound shouldn't exist. Something's fundamentally wrong with it." Police officers dispatched to investigate reported hearing the sound themselves and confirmed it was real, not mass hysteria or a prank. Officer Winter Blake's body camera audio captured approximately 47 seconds of the shriek, and audio analysis later showed it contained frequencies both above and below normal human hearing range, which explained why some people reported feeling the sound as much as hearing it. Dogs throughout the affected area went into panic mode, barking, howling, trying to hide, and animal control received reports of pets injuring themselves, trying to escape their yards or homes. What was particularly disturbing was that pets reacted approximately 30 seconds before humans consciously heard the sound, as if they could sense it coming. The shriek occurred 7 times that first night, each episode lasting between 30 and 90 seconds, with gaps of 15 to 20 minutes between occurrences. During the quiet periods, residents emerged from their homes, gathering in the foggy streets, checking on neighbors, trying to figure out what was happening. Social media exploded with posts from Forest Grove residents, videos capturing the sound, though most phone microphones distorted it into something barely recognizable. Theories ranging from industrial accidents to pranks to genuine fear that something catastrophic was occurring. The Forest Grove Community Facebook group gained 400 new posts in under an hour, with residents comparing experiences and trying to triangulate where the sound was originating. But the sound wasn't the worst part. Between the shriek episodes, during those quiet, fog-filled minutes, multiple residents reported seeing something moving through the fog in the areas around Pacific University campus and the residential streets surrounding it. Zaid Richardson posted a shaky video to social media showing a tall, dark shape moving between houses in his neighborhood, visible only as a shadow darker than the surrounding fog, moving in a way he described as wrong, too fast and too smooth, like it's gliding, not walking. The video went viral locally, and dozens of people commented that they'd seen the same thing. A figure approximately 7 to 8 feet tall, proportions that didn't quite match human anatomy, moving through fog-shrouded yards and streets with apparent purpose. Rain Harlow was outside during the second shriek episode, having gone to her car to retrieve her phone charger, when she saw the figure approximately 20 feet away. Her testimony to police, given while still in shock, described it as tall, very tall, and shaped like a person but stretched wrong. And it turned to look at me when the sound happened, and I felt like it saw me, really saw me. And I ran inside and locked every door and window. Rain's description matched reports from others who saw it closely. The figure appeared to be aware, to be watching, and most disturbing, seemed to be moving systematically through the town, as if searching for something. The first night ended around 3 a.m., when the fog finally lifted and the sound stopped. Forest Grove residents, exhausted and terrified, tried to sleep, many gathering in groups rather than staying alone. The next day, March 8th, was consumed by attempts to find explanations. Pacific University's science department set up monitoring equipment. Local news crews arrived. The city held an emergency town hall meeting where officials proposed theories ranging from unusual atmospheric conditions causing sound distortions to possible industrial equipment malfunctions at nearby facilities. But none of the theories could explain the systematic nature of the occurrences, the physical effects on listeners, or the sightings of the figure in the fog. The second night was worse. The fog returned around 10 p.m., even denser than before, and the sound started at 10:34 p.m. This time, 58 911 calls came in within the first 5 minutes, and several callers reported bleeding from their ears, nosebleeds, or severe headaches caused by the shriek. What made the second night fundamentally more terrifying was that the sightings increased dramatically. The figure, or multiple figures, witnesses couldn't agree, was seen in dozens of locations across a 2-square-mile area. Aubrey Chen's security camera captured it, passing through her backyard. And the timestamp showed it was simultaneously seen by 3 other residents in different locations, suggesting either multiple entities or something that could move impossibly fast or exist in multiple places at once. Jakari Wells, a local journalist, coordinated a group of volunteers to document the phenomenon, setting up a network of cameras and observers across the affected area. What they captured that second night defied explanation. The figure appeared in 14 different locations within the same minute, recorded by separate cameras with the synchronized timestamps. Analysis showed the same entity, same height, same proportions, same movement pattern, appearing in spots that were hundreds of yards apart with no time to travel between them. It was as if the fog itself was creating the figure, or the figure was somehow distributed through the fog, able to manifest wherever the fog was thick enough. The most chilling moment came when the figure approached people directly. Salem Torres was standing in her front yard with her husband Chris and their teenage daughter Mallory when the figure materialized from the fog approximately 15 feet away. Salem's husband had his phone out and captured video of the encounter. The figure stood motionless for approximately 12 seconds, clearly visible despite the fog. And Salem later told investigators it was looking at us, studying us, and its face was wrong. I can't explain what I mean, but the features weren't right. Like someone had tried to make a human face, but didn't quite understand how. Then the shriek happened, and the figure seemed to respond to it, its head tilting as if listening, before it moved away into the fog with that same gliding motion. By the third night, March 9th, Forest Grove was in a state of collective terror. Many residents evacuated, staying with friends or family in neighboring towns. Those who remained did so in groups, gathering in well-lit homes, maintaining constant communication via social media and phone. The fog arrived on schedule, and the sound began at 11:18 p.m. But this third night brought an escalation that suggested the phenomenon was building towards something. The figure was now aggressive in its approach. Multiple residents reported it coming up to windows, pressing close enough that they could see details. Burned or scarred skin visible through the fog, clothing that might have been a uniform but was damaged beyond recognition, hands that were too long with too many joints. Elisa Moreno's Ring doorbell camera captured it, standing directly in front of her door for nearly 3 minutes, appearing to examine the lock, the handle, trying to understand how to enter. The audio from her camera picked up a sound underneath the shriek, something that might have been words, might have been breathing, distorted and wrong, but suggesting intelligence and intention. At 12:47 a.m., local news helicopter footage captured something that became the defining image of the Forest Grove phenomenon. From above, the fog could be seen forming a spiral pattern centered on the Pacific University campus. And at the center of the spiral, barely visible through the fog layers, was a dark shape, the figure, standing perfectly still as if conducting or controlling the entire event. The helicopter's thermal imaging showed the figure as a cold spot, significantly colder than the surrounding air, which shouldn't have been possible if it was a living person or even an animal. The phenomenon ended abruptly at 1:33 a.m. on March 10th. The fog didn't gradually dissipate. It vanished, pulled away as if something had switched it off. And the sound stopped mid-shriek. One moment, Forest Grove was enveloped in terror and fog and that horrible sound. And the next moment, it was a normal March night, clear and quiet. The figure was gone. The fog was gone, and it never returned. The aftermath involved investigations by everyone from local police to state environmental agencies to, according to unconfirmed reports, federal agencies interested in the unexplained nature of the events. No source for the sound was ever identified. No explanation for the fog's behavior was found. The figure was never identified, despite hundreds of hours of video footage and dozens of eyewitness accounts. Forest Grove slowly returned to normal, though normal now meant a town where everyone had experienced something that shattered their understanding of reality. What makes the Forest Grove sound phenomenon particularly significant is that it was a collective experience, documented extensively, witnessed by hundreds of people simultaneously, captured on multiple independent recording devices. This wasn't one person's story that others could dismiss. This was an entire town terrorized for 3 nights by something that shouldn't exist, something that appeared in the fog and watched them and left no answers when it disappeared. The sleep study at Oregon Health and Science University started as routine research into highway hypnosis and driver fatigue. But Dr. Arleth Kim never expected to find herself investigating something that had no place in medical literature. The 42-mile stretch of Highway 1001 between Florence and Coos Bay had been flagged by the Oregon Department of Transportation after 17 separate incidents in 8 months, where drivers reported losing consciousness and waking miles down the road with no memory of driving. What made these cases medically impossible was that analysis of dashcam footage showed all 17 drivers had entered REM sleep, deep, dreaming sleep, while their vehicles continued traveling at highway speeds, navigating curves and traffic, for periods ranging from 12 to 38 minutes. The first case that reached Dr. Kim's attention was Vicente Chen, a pharmaceutical sales representative who made the Florence to Coos Bay drive twice weekly and had never experienced any issues until October 2024. Vicente's account was disturbing in its specificity. He remembered approaching a section of highway around mile marker 187, where fog was rolling in from the ocean. Remembered feeling suddenly exhausted despite having slept well the previous night. And remembered seeing a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. His last conscious thought was pressing his brake pedal, concerned about the person he'd seen. And then nothing. A complete blank, until he woke with a start in a rest area parking lot 31 miles south, engine still running, vehicle perfectly parked between the lines. Vicente's confusion turned to horror when he checked his dashcam footage. The video showed him approaching the figure, which appeared only as a dark shape in the fog, and then his head turning slowly away from the road, turning to look at his passenger seat as if watching something beside him. His eyes closed. And for the next 26 minutes, the footage showed Vicente slumped in his seat, head tilted at an angle consistent with deep sleep. While his vehicle maintained perfect lane position, navigated 4 significant curves, passed 2 slower vehicles, and eventually pulled smoothly into the rest area and parked. His hands never touched the steering wheel during this period. The wheel turned on its own, making precise adjustments that kept the vehicle centered in the lane. Dr. Kim initially suspected the footage had been edited, some kind of elaborate hoax. But forensic analysis of the video file showed no tampering. The timestamps matched Vicente's GPS data exactly. More disturbing was the medical evaluation. Vicente's smartwatch, which monitored his heart rate and sleep patterns, showed he had entered stage 3 non-REM sleep at 3:17 p.m. while driving, then transitioned to REM sleep at 3:28 p.m. These sleep stages should have been impossible to achieve while sitting upright in a moving vehicle, and they certainly should have resulted in immediate loss of vehicle control and a fatal accident. The second case, just 3 weeks later, involved a family, Jakari and Liana Martinez, traveling with their 10-year-old daughter Matilda. They were heading south on Highway 101 around 7 p.m. when, according to their later testimony, they all saw the same thing. A figure standing near mile marker 184, visible through coastal fog that had settled over the highway. Jakari, who was driving, said he had just enough time to think who would be out there before exhaustion hit him like a physical force. His wife Liana described the same sensation, sudden, overwhelming sleepiness that felt chemical, artificial, nothing like normal tiredness. Matilda, in the back seat, later told investigators that she saw a person getting into the front seat with Daddy before she fell asleep. The Martinez family's dash cam showed all three of them falling asleep within seconds of each other. Jakari's head dropped forward, Liana's tilted to the side, and in the rear view mirror, Matilda could be seen slumping against her car seat. For the next 38 minutes, their vehicle traveled 33 miles of Highway 101, maintaining perfect speed control, navigating construction zones where lanes were narrowed, and eventually pulling into a rest stop where it parked in the space farthest from other vehicles, in a corner spot that would be considered the safest position in the lot. When the family woke simultaneously, as if an alarm had been triggered, they found themselves perfectly safe, but with zero memory of the journey. Medical examinations conducted by Dr. Kim's team revealed impossible neurological data. All three family members showed brain activity patterns consistent with having been in REM sleep for the duration of their unconscious period. The EEG patterns, reconstructed from their smartwatches and fitness trackers, showed synchronized sleep cycles, all three entering and exiting sleep stages at exactly the same moments, which should have been statistically impossible for three unrelated individuals. More troubling was evidence of unusual neural activity in the regions of the brain associated with passenger recognition and social awareness, as if their brains believed someone else was present in the vehicle with them. By January 2025, Dr. Kim had documented 9 additional cases, all following the same pattern. Drivers approaching coastal fog near mile markers 184, 189 on Highway 101, sighting a figure on or near the roadway, sudden overwhelming sleep, and periods of unconscious travel during which vehicles operated with superhuman precision. The commonalities were too specific to dismiss. Dr. Kim expanded her investigation, installing monitoring equipment along the highway section and recruiting volunteer drivers willing to be extensively monitored with medical sensors while driving the route. The breakthrough came when volunteer Gracelyn Walsh, equipped with a full EEG monitoring cap and multiple cameras, drove the route on a foggy February evening. Gracelyn reported seeing the figure near mile marker 187, described feeling like I'd been drugged, like someone had injected me with sedatives, and remembered her last conscious thought. Someone's in the car with me. The monitoring equipment captured her transition into unconscious sleep within 8 seconds of that final thought. But it also captured something else: auditory data from multiple microphones placed throughout the vehicle. While Gracelyn slept, the microphones recorded sounds: the subtle creak of the passenger seat adjusting, the whisper of fabric against upholstery suggesting movement, and most disturbing, breathing. A second respiratory pattern, distinct from Gracelyn's own sleeping breath. Analysis showed the breathing pattern was slower, deeper, and remained consistent throughout the 30-minute period of unconscious driving. Something was in the vehicle with Gracelyn. Something that breathed. Something that apparently took control of driving while she slept. The video footage showed nothing visible in the passenger seat, but thermal imaging data revealed a cold spot, a region of space approximately the size and shape of a seated human that registered 15 degrees colder than ambient temperature. This cold spot remained stable throughout the drive, shifting slightly as if adjusting position, and disappeared the moment Gracelyn woke in the rest area parking lot. Dr. Kim's research took an unexpected turn when she discovered historical records of accidents on that exact stretch of Highway 101. Between 1994 and 2015, there had been 47 fatal single-vehicle accidents in that 8-mile section, an abnormally high concentration. Many involved drivers who appeared to have fallen asleep at the wheel, veering off the road into ocean cliffs or colliding with barriers. The accident rate dropped dramatically after 2015, not because of road improvements or increased enforcement, but seemingly spontaneously. The most chilling detail came from accident reconstruction reports. In 12 of the fatal crashes, investigators noted anomalies, steering inputs that suggested someone had tried to regain control, brake applications moments before impact that weren't consistent with an unconscious driver. And in 3 cases, reports from witnesses who claimed to have seen 2 figures in vehicles that were later found to contain only 1 occupant. The reports had been dismissed as observer error or optical illusions caused by fog and distance. Dr. Kim's working theory, one she struggles to voice in professional settings, is that something experienced on that highway section in the years before 2015, possibly someone who died trying to help or save others, now exists in a state that allows it to interact with vehicles and drivers during specific fog conditions. Unlike the malevolent entities from other highway stories, this presence appears protective rather than threatening. It induces sleep in drivers approaching dangerous situations, drivers who are fatigued, distracted, or impaired, and safely guides their vehicles to rest areas. The phenomenon continues, averaging 4 to 5 cases per month during fog season. Dr. Kim has documented over 60 incidents, and the pattern remains consistent. Drivers see the figure, fall into immediate deep sleep, wake in safe locations with no memory of traveling. Medical analysis shows they experience genuine REM sleep during these episodes, suggesting whatever takes control of their vehicles also protects their psychological state, perhaps preventing the panic and trauma that would come from being aware while unable to control one's body. The most unsettling cases involve audio recordings that capture what sounds like a voice during the unconscious periods. Too distorted for clear analysis, but suggesting words, perhaps reassurances spoken to sleeping drivers. Multiple drivers, including Vicente Chen and the Martinez family, reported dreams during their unconscious periods, dreams of someone telling them, "You're safe now. Rest, I'll get you there safely." They wake feeling not terrorized, but cared for, though deeply disturbed by the violation of their consciousness and autonomy. The Oregon Department of Transportation now includes warnings about driver fatigue specific to that section of Highway 101, though they carefully avoid mentioning the true nature of the phenomenon. Dr. Kim continues her research, unable to explain in medical terms what she's documenting, but certain of one thing: something that understands how to operate modern vehicles, something that can induce sleep and navigate foggy coastal highways with supernatural skill, has taken up residence on Highway 101. And whatever its origin or nature, it's still there, still watching for drivers in distress, still reaching out from the fog to take the wheel when human hands fail. The California-Oregon border crossing at Siskiyou Summit sits at 4,210 feet elevation, and during winter months, Interstate 5 becomes one of the most treacherous stretches of highway on the West Coast. The 6% grade combined with black ice, sudden fog banks, and blizzard conditions creates a perfect storm for vehicular disasters. But there's something else happening on that summit, something that 3 separate drivers experienced in January 2025. And what makes their account so disturbing isn't what they saw. It's what they learned afterward about the people who saved their lives. Aubrey Henderson was the first to report the incident, though she didn't think much of it initially beyond feeling grateful and slightly confused. Aubrey had been driving north from Sacramento to Portland on January 14th, making good time until she hit the summit around 9 p.m. and drove straight into a fog bank so dense it felt like entering a tunnel of white. Her Honda Civic started making a terrible grinding noise, then began losing power. She managed to pull onto the shoulder before the engine died completely, and she sat there in the fog with her hazard lights on, phone showing no signal, genuinely frightened because temperatures were dropping fast and she could see her breath inside the car. She'd been sitting there maybe 10 minutes, trying to decide whether to start walking despite the danger, when someone tapped on her passenger window. Aubrey nearly screamed. She hadn't seen anyone approaching, hadn't heard footsteps. But when she looked, there was a man standing there in what looked like a highway patrol uniform from decades ago, the style all wrong for modern standards. He gestured for her to roll down the window, and when she did, he leaned in and said in a calm, reassuring voice, "Your alternator belt snapped. I've got a spare in my trunk. Let me fix it for you." Aubrey wanted to ask who he was, how he knew what was wrong with her car, why he had a spare alternator belt just sitting in his trunk. But something about his presence was so authoritative and calm that she just nodded and popped her hood. The man, he never gave his name, worked on her car for maybe 15 minutes while Aubrey sat inside trying to stay warm. She could hear him working, hear the clink of tools, occasional muttered comments to himself. When he finished, he tapped on her window again and told her to try starting the car. It started immediately, engine running smoothly. Aubrey got out to thank him, to offer money or at least get his name, but he waved her off. "Just doing my job," he said. "You drive safe now. This summit takes people in weather like this." Something about the way he said "takes people" made Aubrey's skin prickle. But before she could respond, he walked back toward the rear of her car and disappeared into the fog. She waited a moment, then got back in her car and drove away, shaken but safe. The next day, after arriving in Portland, Aubrey took her car to a mechanic to have it properly checked. The mechanic confirmed that her alternator belt had been replaced, but what confused him was the belt itself. "This is a vintage part," he told her. "They haven't made alternator belts like this in maybe 30 years. It works, it's holding fine, but it's definitely not a modern part. Where did you get this?" Aubrey explained what had happened on the summit, and the mechanic's expression changed. He pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph. "Did the guy who helped you look like this?" The photograph showed a California Highway Patrol officer from the 1970s, and Aubrey felt ice water run through her veins because, yes, that was exactly the man who'd fixed her car. The mechanic explained that the officer in the photo, whose name was Truett Morrison, had died in 1979 while helping a stranded motorist on Siskiyou Summit. A drunk driver had hit him while he was changing someone's tire in fog conditions almost identical to what Aubrey had experienced. The second incident was Xiomara Bennett, just 3 days later on January 17th. Xiomara was traveling south with her elderly mother Dorothy in the passenger seat when their minivan overheated on the summit. They pulled over, and Xiomara was trying to figure out what to do. Her mother was diabetic and needed her medication soon. They had no cell service, and the fog was so thick that passing vehicles couldn't see them until they were dangerously close. Xiomara was on the verge of panic when she saw headlights approaching from behind, and a tow truck pulled up with a driver who looked impossibly young, maybe early 20s, wearing coveralls with a name patch that said Sam. Sam checked their engine, told them their radiator hose had burst, and said he could patch it enough to get them to the next town. While he worked, he chatted with Dorothy about the old days, about what the summit used to be like before they'd improved the road. and Dorothy later told Xiomara that something about his knowledge seemed off. He talked about events from the 1960s and 70s as if he'd been there, but he couldn't have been born yet based on his age. Sam got their van running, refused payment beyond a coffee when they reached town, and drove off in his tow truck. But when Xiomara tried to find his company to send a proper thank you and payment, she discovered something impossible. The tow company, whose name was on the truck, Siskiyou Recovery Services, had gone out of business in 1983. And when she tracked down the owner's family, they showed her photographs of employees. Sam was there, in a photo from 1981, looking exactly the same age as when he'd helped Xiomara. His full name was Sam Cordova, and he'd died in 1982 in a tow truck accident on the summit, while rescuing a family stranded in fog. The third case, Holly Martinez, completed a pattern that investigators couldn't ignore. Holly's car had broken down on the summit on January 22nd around 10 p.m., and she'd been helped by a woman named Michelle, who appeared out of the fog on foot, carrying a medical kit. Holly had been having chest pains, possibly a panic attack or something worse. And Michelle, who said she was a nurse, checked her vitals, gave her aspirin, talked her through breathing exercises, and stayed with her until the tow truck arrived. Michelle then walked back into the fog before Holly could properly thank her. Holly tracked down Michelle through the description she gave to the tow truck driver, and discovered that Michelle Garcia had been a nurse who died in 1995 while stopping to help accident victims on Siskiyou Summit. She'd been struck by another vehicle while rendering aid during a foggy night, almost exactly 30 years before she appeared to help Holly. Oregon State Police quietly investigated all three incidents, interviewed the drivers, examined the physical evidence: the vintage alternator belt on Aubrey's car, the repair work on Xiomara's van that showed techniques no longer commonly used, the aspirin packet Michelle had given Holly that had expiration dates from the 1990s. The pattern was undeniable. Drivers in distress on Siskiyou Summit during fog were being helped by people who had died years or decades earlier while performing similar acts of assistance. What makes these cases different from typical ghost stories is the physical nature of the interventions. These weren't apparitions or visions. They were solid, real, capable of manipulating physical objects, performing complex mechanical repairs, providing medical care. They left behind evidence that could be tested and analyzed. They existed in our world long enough to complete their tasks, then disappeared back into the fog they'd emerged from. The most disturbing revelation came when researchers compiled a complete list of people who died on Siskiyou Summit while helping others. Highway patrol officers, tow truck drivers, nurses and EMTs, even other motorists who'd stopped to assist and been killed for their compassion. The list contained 47 names spanning from 1952 to 2018, and drivers reported encountering at least 19 of them during fog conditions, always appearing when someone needed exactly the kind of help that person had specialized in providing while alive. The fog on Siskiyou Summit, it seems, doesn't just obscure vision. It creates a space where those who died helping others can continue their work, reaching across whatever barrier separates life from death to provide assistance one more time. They appear real because in those moments, in that fog, they are real. The summit has become a place where compassion transcends death, where the impulse to help others is so strong it literally pulls souls back from wherever they've gone. But there's a darker implication that investigators don't like to discuss publicly. Every person who's received help from these impossible rescuers reports the same final words: drive safe. This summit takes people. It's a warning, but it might also be something else. A reminder that the fog is always watching, always waiting. and that every act of kindness on that summit might be creating another helper who will never leave. Forever bound to that stretch of highway, forever compelled to assist others even in death. The fog doesn't just preserve them, it keeps them. And whether that's salvation or imprisonment, nobody can say. The phenomenon, documented by search and rescue teams in Washington's North Cascades, has a clinical name: collective spatial disorientation with temporal anomaly. But the people who've experienced it just call it the missing mile. Highway 20 between New Harlem and Diablo Lake has always been challenging. A narrow ribbon of asphalt carved into mountainsides with drops that plunge hundreds of feet into glacial rivers below. But something changed in that 8-mile section in 2023. And what firefighter Danny Sullivan documented before he disappeared completely has become the subject of sealed federal investigation files and hushed warnings passed between local emergency responders. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong came in June 2024, when 3 separate vehicles were reported missing on Highway 20 within a single week, all last confirmed passing through the same section near Diablo Lake. Helena Park's sedan, Milo Foster's pickup truck, and a rental car driven by tourist couple Mallory and Hassan Williams all vanished completely. No accident debris, no vehicles found in ravines, no trace on any security cameras beyond a certain point. Search helicopters covered every inch of terrain. Dive teams checked the lake. Ground crews hiked miles of forest. Nothing. It was as if the vehicles and their occupants had simply ceased to exist somewhere between mile markers that couldn't be more than 8 miles apart. Danny Sullivan, a 15-year veteran of the Skagit County Fire Department, volunteered to investigate after the 3rd disappearance. Danny had a reputation for being thorough, skeptical of supernatural explanations, the kind of person who believed every mystery had a rational solution if you looked hard enough. On July 2nd, 2024, Danny equipped his personal truck with multiple GPS trackers, 3 separate camera systems, a satellite phone, and enough emergency equipment to survive a week in the wilderness. He planned to drive the route slowly, document everything, and prove that whatever was happening had a logical explanation. Maybe a section of road prone to drivers falling asleep and veering off into areas searchers had somehow missed. Maybe some kind of criminal activity. Maybe just terrible coincidence. Danny's satellite phone transmitted his position every 30 seconds to a monitoring station. His video cameras uploaded footage in real time to cloud storage. At 2:47 p.m., his GPS showed him entering the section of Highway 20 near Diablo Lake. His dashcam footage showed normal driving conditions. Clear weather, good visibility, no other traffic. At 2:51 p.m., Danny's voice on the audio recording noted that he was passing a sign indicating Diablo Lake viewpoint ahead. At 2:52 p.m., his GPS position began doing something that telecommunications engineers later confirmed was impossible. It started showing him traveling along roads that don't exist on any map. Roads that would require him to be driving through solid mountain terrain or across the lake itself. The video footage from this period shows Danny's growing confusion. His dash cam shows Highway 20 ahead of him, looking completely normal, but his GPS is insisting he's miles off course. Danny's voice, initially calm and analytical, becomes uncertain. This doesn't make sense. I'm on the highway. I can see the center line. I can see the markers. But according to GPS, I'm not on any road. This has to be equipment failure. He continues driving, expecting to reach the next recognizable landmark. But the road just continues. Curve after curve, no landmarks appearing where they should be. At 3:04 p.m., Danny reports seeing another vehicle ahead of him. His dashcam captured it clearly, a sedan matching the description of Helena Park's missing vehicle, driving normally about 100 yards ahead. Danny accelerated to catch up, trying to signal the driver, but couldn't close the distance no matter how fast he drove. The sedan maintained its position, always visible but unreachable, like a mirage that receded as he approached. At 3:11 p.m., Danny's voice carries genuine fear for the first time. I've been driving for 19 minutes. At highway speed, I should have traveled at least 15 miles. But I haven't passed any of the landmarks. It's like the road is extending, like I'm not making actual progress. I can see behind me, see where I've been. But when I check the GPS, it's like I'm traveling in circles, or not circles, something worse. The coordinates are changing, but they're not sequential. They're jumping. His breathing becomes rapid, and he makes the decision to stop, to turn around, to return the way he came. But when Danny stopped his truck and looked in his rearview mirror, the road behind him wasn't there. The dashcam footage shows it clearly. He's sitting on a section of highway that extends forward, but behind him is just fog. Dense, white fog that appeared instantly and now blocks any view of where he'd been. Danny's satellite phone still showed a signal, and he called his supervisor. I'm stuck. The road behind me is gone. I'm going to continue forward, try to find somewhere to turn around safely. At 3:27 p.m., Danny encountered something that the dashcam footage shows, but that defies explanation. Another vehicle appeared ahead of him, this time the pickup truck matching Milo Foster's description. But this vehicle wasn't moving forward. It was driving in reverse, backward along the highway at what appeared to be normal speed, as if someone was playing footage in reverse. Danny slowed down, and the truck reversed past him. Through the driver's window, Danny's camera captured a glimpse of the driver's face. Milo Foster, eyes wide with terror, mouth open in what might have been a scream. But the truck continued reversing past and disappeared around the curve behind Danny's position. The footage shows Danny sitting motionless for nearly a minute, processing what he'd just seen. Then his voice, shaking. I need to document this. This is real. The footage is recording. That was a missing person driving backward, and he looked aware. He looked terrified. But his truck was moving backward like time is flowing wrong here. I'm going to keep going forward. I have to find the end of this. At 3:43 p.m., Danny's GPS showed him traveling his 127th mile despite having entered the 8-mile section less than an hour earlier. The dashcam footage shows the highway ahead looking identical to footage from 40 minutes earlier. Same curves, same trees, same pavement markings, as if he's driving a loop, but there's no indication of where the loop connects. And then Danny saw them. Multiple vehicles. All the missing vehicles, all driving the road in various directions. Some going forward, some in reverse, some appearing to be traveling sideways somehow. Visible through the trees, as if on parallel roads that shouldn't exist. At 4:02 p.m., Danny made a decision that likely saved his life. He started driving backward. His reasoning, recorded on audio, was that if Milo Foster's truck had been moving backward, maybe that was the way out. Maybe the road's logic was inverted or needed to be reversed to escape. The footage shows him carefully backing up along the highway, using his mirrors. And at 4:09 p.m., his GPS suddenly jumped back to a normal position. He was entering the section of Highway 20 he'd entered over an hour earlier. But coming from the opposite direction, as if by driving backward, he'd somehow reversed his journey through the anomaly. Danny emerged from the missing mile, drove directly to the nearest ranger station, and submitted his evidence to authorities. His GPS data showed he'd traveled 147 miles in an area that's 8 miles long. His timestamps matched the monitoring station's records, confirming he'd been missing from normal space for 1 hour and 22 minutes. The video footage was analyzed by experts who confirmed it showed real vehicles, real roads, and apparent violations of normal physics and geography. Danny refused to ever drive that section of Highway 20 again, and he spent months advocating for the road to be closed pending investigation. But here's the most disturbing part. Danny's case is the only one where someone escaped. Helena Park, Milo Foster, the Williams couple, and 17 other people who've disappeared on that section since 2023 are still missing. And there's evidence suggesting they might still be there, still driving that impossible road, experiencing minutes that stretch into hours, traveling miles that should have ended but never do. Late at night, when fog settles into the North Cascades, residents near Highway 20 report hearing vehicles in the distance, engines and tires on pavement, coming from directions where no roads exist. Search and rescue teams have picked up radio transmissions from the missing mile. Desperate voices calling for help, providing GPS coordinates that place them in impossible locations, asking how to escape from a road that should have ended but continues forever. The transmissions are brief, often cut off mid-sentence, and attempts to respond receive no acknowledgement, as if the people trapped inside can transmit out but can't receive anything from our reality. The most recent investigation, conducted in October 2025, deployed drones equipped with advanced sensors into the area. The drones recorded footage that shows something impossible: sections of Highway 20 that exist in multiple states simultaneously, roads that shimmer and overlap, vehicles visible for seconds before disappearing, and at the center of it all, a dense fog bank that shouldn't be there, that weather patterns can't explain, that seems to be the source or gateway of the phenomenon. The fog doesn't move with wind, doesn't dissipate with temperature changes. It just exists, waiting, and everything that enters it becomes part of the missing mile, becomes part of a road that has no end, trapped in a journey that will last forever. Danny Sullivan has tried to enter again, tried to rescue those still trapped, but his truck won't start when he approaches that section now, as if the vehicle itself remembers and refuses to return. He's given testimony to federal investigators, shared his footage with researchers, and warned anyone who'll listen that Highway 20 between New Harlem and Diablo Lake isn't just dangerous. It's fundamentally broken, a place where the rules that govern distance and time have failed, where the fog has created something that shouldn't exist. And every month, despite warnings, despite closed road signs during fog conditions, someone else disappears into the missing mile, adding to the number of people trapped in an endless drive through a reality that's separated from our own by nothing more than dense white fog. If these stories from the foggy highways of Oregon and Washington have left you looking over your shoulder, if you're wondering what else is out there in the white, waiting for the next driver to enter its domain, then you're exactly where you should be. Subscribe to Verified Fears for more stories that exist in that uncomfortable space between documented fact and unexplainable terror. Because the fog remembers everything that happens within it, and these 11 stories are just the beginning of what it's willing to show us.